Mesa Lark, New Mexico Territory, 1879. It was not a place of comfort. It was a place of arrival, and, for many, a place of endings. The sun, at 4 in the afternoon in late autumn, was a low, angry eye, searing the horizon with shades of ochre and bruised purple. It offered no warmth, only a harsh, clarifying light that exposed every crack in the dry earth, every splinter on the false-fronted buildings. The wind was the true owner of this town. It came from the north, carrying nothing but distance and grit. It scoured the main plaza, a wide patch of beaten dirt that separated the Dusty Bell Saloon from the Mercantile, the land office from the smithy. The wind pushed tiny pellets of sand that stung any exposed skin and sounded like 1,000 tiny rattlesnakes hissing under the boardwalks. It was a mean wind, a wind that stole breath and soured tempers. This was the sound that greeted the overland stagecoach as it groaned into town. The heavy thud of the brake blocks, the jingle of the exhausted harness, and the weary curses of the driver were all consumed by the wind's low moan. The coach, its paint blistered and its leather cracked, looked less like a vehicle and more like a refugee. It pulled to a halt in a cloud of alkali dust directly in front of the blacksmith's shop, where the rhythmic clang of hammer on anvil was the town's only heartbeat. For a moment, nothing happened. The 2 lathered horses in the team dropped their heads, sides heaving. A few curtains twitched in the windows above the Mercantile. From the saloon, the tinny sound of a poorly played piano stopped mid-measure. Then, the coach door swung open with a shriek of dry hinges. A man was already waiting. He stood separate from the meager shadow of the smithy's awning, fully in the unforgiving light. Colt Avery. He was a tall man, built not with the heavy muscle of the blacksmith, but with the lean, ropey strength of someone who wrestled with fences and stubborn mules. His shoulders were wide, straining the fabric of a shirt that had once been his best. It was clean, meticulously pressed, but the sun had bleached it to the color of old bone. He held his hat in his hands, revealing hair the color of sun-cured hay. His hands were scarred, the palms and fingers thickened with calluses from reins and axe handles. In one of those rough hands, he held a small, tight bunch of wild asters, their purple heads already drooping, the roots still clinging to clumps of dark, damp earth. He had pulled them from the creek bed, not bought them. He looked uncomfortable, a statue carved from anxiety and resolve, his eyes fixed on the dark doorway of the coach. The first thing to emerge was a boot, small, scuffed at the toe, but polished, then a skirt of heavy, practical gray wool. Finally, Nora Vale stepped down onto the wooden platform. She was a creature of shadow in the blazing light. Her dress was modest to the point of severe, with a high collar and long sleeves. A dark neckerchief was pulled up, covering her chin and mouth, and a wide-brimmed hat was pulled so low it was impossible to see her eyes. She wore no veil. A veil was for brides, for women who expected to be looked at. Nora Vale, it seemed, expected only to be obscured. She clutched a single carpet bag. The tapestry weave was frayed at the edges, the leather handle worn smooth and dark where her hand had gripped it for hundreds of miles. She stepped clear of the coach and stood on the boardwalk, a small, gray island in the sea of dust and noise. She did not look at him. She looked at the warped boards at her feet. Colt Avery took 1 step forward, then stopped. The asters looked suddenly ridiculous in his large hand. The silence stretched. It became heavier than the coach. The wind whipped a strand of dark hair from under Nora's hat and lashed it across her cheek. She did not raise a hand to brush it away. Then the blacksmith's hammer, which had paused in its arc, fell. Clang! The sound was brutal, definitive. It shattered the quiet, and in that ringing echo, Nora Vale spoke. Her voice was so low it was almost part of the wind, a dry rustle of leaves. She spoke to the ground. "I'm not pretty." It was not an apology. It was a statement of fact, a final term laid down before a bargain was struck. She had traveled more than 1,000 miles to say these 3 words. Colt Avery did not flinch. He did not lean in, did not try to peer under the brim of her hat. His gaze remained steady, fixed somewhere over her shoulder at the red bluffs that framed the town. He looked at the woman, but he did not scrutinize the features she worked so hard to hide. He let the wind die down for a second before he answered, his own voice as dry and practical as the land itself. "That's fine." He waited another beat, letting the first 2 words settle. Then he added, "I need honest, not fancy." Nora's shoulders, which had been tensed so high they nearly touched her earlobes, lowered by perhaps half an inch. It was the only sign that she had heard, that his reply had registered. The plaza, which had held its breath, exhaled. From the Dusty Bell Saloon, the piano resumed its clumsy tune. A burst of rough laughter followed. 4 or 5 cowhands, idle and mean with afternoon whiskey, were watching from the saloon's shade. Their eyes were not respectful like Colt's. They were invasive, speculative, stripping the gray dress from the new arrival, assessing her worth as they would a horse. One of them spat a stream of tobacco juice into the dust, a gesture of profound, casual contempt. "Avery's mail order," one of them drawled. "Just loud enough to carry? Looks like he got the bottom of the barrel." Colt Avery's head turned, very slowly. His eyes, which had been neutral, hardened into chips of blue ice. He said nothing. He didn't have to. The men in the saloon knew that look. The laughter died, and the men shuffled back into the darkness of the bar. The blacksmith, a broad man named Ronan Shaw, gave a final, resounding clang with his hammer and set it down, wiping his hands on a leather apron. His was a look of pity, not malice. He gave Colt a short, grim nod, as if to say, "Good luck to you, son." Colt turned back to Nora. He gestured with his chin toward her bag, the flowers still clutched in his other hand. "Ma'am, I can take that." Nora shook her head. A small, sharp movement. She shifted her grip on the handle, her knuckles white. That bag was her entire world, her last piece of the life she had left. It was her armor. "I can manage," she whispered, her voice still muffled by the scarf. "All right." He did not press. He simply turned and walked toward a buckboard wagon parked near the water trough. Nora hesitated, then followed. She kept an exact and deliberate distance behind him, not 1 step, which would imply intimacy, nor 5, which would imply reluctance. She kept 3 steps between them, the precise, unspoken distance of a business arrangement. The wagon was like the man, strong, unadorned, and weathered. It was hitched to a single chestnut mare who flicked her ears as they approached. Colt tossed the wilting flowers into the back, where they landed on a burlap sack, a sudden, sad splash of purple against the brown. He moved to the side of the wagon, waiting to help her up. Nora ignored his waiting hand. She put her bag onto the wooden seat first, then, using the iron wheel hub as a step, hoisted herself up with a small, ungraceful movement. She slid across the bench, leaving the reins for him, and settled herself as far to the other side as she could, her gray skirts tucked neatly around her ankles. Colt watched her for a second, his face unreadable. He walked around the front of the mare, patting her neck, and climbed up onto his own side. The wooden bench groaned under his weight. He picked up the reins, the leather creaking in his calloused hands, with a soft click of his tongue. The mare leaned into the harness, and the buckboard lurched forward. They rolled past the mercantile, past the land office, past the silent, staring faces in the saloon. Nora Vale kept her head down, the brim of her hat a rigid shield against the prying eyes of Mesa Lark. The townspeople watched them go, this strange, silent pair, the solitary rancher and the woman who hid her face. As the buckboard reached the edge of town, the dirt road began to climb. It snaked up into the high country, toward a place the locals called Sparrow Gulch. The grass on either side of the track was the color of ash, and it bent low to the ground. bowing in submission to the relentless wind. For a long time, the only sound was the thump of the mare's hooves and the steady creak, creak, creak of the wagon wheels. Colt did not try to fill the silence with the easy, false chatter of a stranger. He was a man who used words as tools, not as decoration. Finally, he pointed with a gloved finger to the west. "Water," he said. Nora looked. She saw only a dry, rocky wash, a scar in the earth. "The creek runs dry by August," he explained, his voice even. "We haul from the cistern till the spring rains. Cistern's full." Nora nodded, a tiny dip of her chin. They drove on. The road grew steeper. The air grew thinner. 10 minutes later, he pointed again, this time to a faint line of wooden posts marching over a hill. "Fences. That's the east pasture. Lost 2 head to coyotes last week. Needs mending." Again, she nodded. This was a language she understood. Work, repairs, survival. "Cowshed is sound," he added, as if an afterthought. "Re-roofed it before the first snow." "That's good," she whispered. It was the first time she had spoken since the plaza. Colt looked at her then, just a quick glance. He saw the tension in her back, the way she sat perched on the very edge of the seat, as if ready to fly. He gestured with his head toward the wagon bed behind them. "There's tea, in the thermos." Nora turned. Tucked into a corner, beside a coil of rope and a shovel, was a small, dented tin thermos. Next to it, weighted down by a small rock, was a piece of folded brown paper. She reached back, her gray glove hesitant, and picked up the paper. She unfolded it in her lap. The handwriting was stark, clumsy, the letters formed by a hand more used to a branding iron than a pen. It said 2 words, "Welcome, Miss Vale." Nora stared at the note. She read the words over and over, as if they were in a foreign language. She traced the shape of the W with her gloved finger. She did not open the thermos of mint tea. She simply refolded the note and slipped it deep into the pocket of her dress. The buckboard crested the last rise. The wheels left the rutted track of the main road and rolled onto the harder-packed dirt of a private drive. The sun was now touching the tips of the distant mountains, bleeding red light across the landscape. The town of Mesa Lark was gone, hidden by a dozen folds of the high desert. The dust from their wheels rose up behind them, a thick curtain that officially severed her from everything she had ever known. And there, in front of them, it stood, a dark log house, small and square, sitting alone on a ridge of red earth. It looked as if it had been dropped from the sky, a solitary, defiant shape against the enormous, darkening sky. There were no other houses, no neighbors, nothing but the wind, the gray grass, and the approaching night. This was Sparrow Gulch. This was home. Colt Avery pulled the mare to a halt. The sudden silence was deafening. "We're here," he said. The blackness of the cabin was still absolute, a thick, cold velvet. When Nora Vale's eyes opened, there was no rooster crow. Not yet. The only sound was the low, mournful sigh of the wind pressing against the chinking of the log walls. She did not light a lamp. She knew the space by feel, by the number of steps from her cot to the stove. Her feet, bare and silent, found the cold plank floor. She moved with an economy of motion that was almost unnatural, a routine drilled into her by years of needing to be useful above all else. Her first act was always the stove. She opened the cast-iron door, the small squeak of the hinge sounding like a shout in the stillness. She laid the kindling dry juniper twigs Colt left in a box by the hearth in a careful lattice, adding larger pieces of piñón. A single match, a gentle breath, and the fire caught, a hungry orange blossom in the dark. As the iron began to tick and warm, she worked. She pulled the heavy sack of flour, scooped a measure into a wide wooden bowl, added lard and water. Her hands worked the dough quickly, kneading and folding, turning and pressing. She did not hum. She did not welcome the day. She simply met it, armed for the tasks it demanded. While the biscuits baked, she took the lye soap heavy, smelling sharply of pine and a bucket of water. She scrubbed the floor of the small kitchen area, starting at the farthest corner and working her way back. The rhythmic swish-swish of the brush on the wood was a prayer of its own, a prayer of erasure. She was scrubbing away the day before, scrubbing away the dust, scrubbing away the memory of the eyes in town. She was making the space clean, making it worthy. She was earning her keep. When the sky outside had turned from black to a deep, bruised purple, she heard the thump of Colt's boots hitting the floor in the other room. He was a quiet man, but the house was small. She quickly rinsed her hands, dried them on her apron, and poured the boiling water into the coffee pot. By the time he emerged, washed and dressed in his work clothes, the cabin was warm. The smell of baking biscuits and strong coffee had replaced the cold scent of the night. He nodded to her. "Mornin', ma'am." Mr. Avery," she replied, her voice still low, keeping her face turned toward the stove. He took his coffee and one of the biscuits, wrapped it in a cloth, and headed for the door. "I'll be on the East Range," he said. "Yes, sir." He paused at the door, hat in hand. "There's tea on the table." He left, the door shut softly. She turned. On the rough-hewn table, next to her own cup, was a tin mug of steaming water with mint leaves floating in it, and beside that, a scrap of paper, torn from a ledger book. She picked it up. The pencil marks were thick and dark, the hand that wrote them more comfortable with a rope than a pen. The north calf is standing. Yesterday's note had said, "East fence mile done before the wind. The day before. Found the spring. Water's clear." Nora sipped the tea. It was hot and sharp. She looked at the note again, then folded it carefully. Her eyes drifted to the small, wavy piece of looking-glass hanging by the door, the one Colt used for shaving. The silvering was flaking at the edges, distorting the reflection of the room. Nora looked away instantly, her gaze dropping to the floor. She turned her back to it, busying herself with the breakfast dishes. She counted the plates. 1, 2. She counted the forks. She counted the tasks left before noon, mending the feed sacks, airing the blankets, checking the bean stores. She counted anything and everything, so long as she did not have to count the marks on her own face. The days settled into this rhythm. He worked outside the house. She worked inside it. They were two planets in a tiny, shared orbit, held together by a gravity of necessity, never touching. The evenings were the hardest. The sun would set, and the vast, empty darkness of Sparrow Gulch would press in on the little cabin. They would eat at the small table. The click of cutlery on the tin plates was the only conversation. Nora would serve the stew or the beans. Tonight, it was a thin rabbit soup. She ladled it into his bowl, her hand steady. Colt did not watch her face. He had, perhaps by instinct or by a deep, buried well of decency, understood the rules. He never looked at her directly when she was serving, never stared when she was looking down. Instead, he watched her hands. He watched the way her long, pale fingers gripped the ladle. He saw the small, puckered white scar on her left knuckle, a burn from the stove last week. He saw the way she tucked her thumb when she set the bowl down, a gesture that was both efficient and oddly delicate. Her hands were clean, capable. They were hands that worked, hands that didn't fiddle or fuss. They were honest hands. "This is good soup, ma'am," he said, tasting it. "Thank you, Mr. Avery." "Colt," he said, not looking up from his bowl. She paused, the ladle halfway to her own bowl. "Ma'am?" "Colt, my name. You don't have to Mr. Avery me." "Oh." She set the ladle down. "Nora, then." "Nora," he repeated. It sounded solid in his mouth. They ate the rest of the meal in their usual silence. But the silence felt different. It was no longer a space between them, but a space they shared. A week later, the rhythm broke. The well bucket. A heavy oak thing bound in iron, jammed. Nora pulled, but the rope went taut, the crank refusing to turn. She pulled again, her boots sliding in the mud, but it was stuck fast, halfway down the shaft. She felt a hot flush of panic. Water was life. A stuck bucket was a disaster. She went to the barn, where Colt was reshoeing the chestnut mare. The bucket, she stammered, hating the weakness in her voice. It's caught. He dropped the mare's hoof, grabbed a length of rope and a grappling hook, and followed her. He peered down the dark, stone-lined shaft. Wedge, he grunted. Slipped its mooring, likely caught on a stone. He handed her the main rope. Just hold this. Keep it steady. Don't let it slip, but don't pull. She wrapped the thick hemp rope around her hands, bracing her feet. Colt lay flat on his stomach, his head and shoulders disappearing into the dark, damp hole. He worked the grappling hook down with his other arm, fishing in the blackness. A little slack. Nora, easy. She let the rope slide, inch by inch. The wind was high today, and it tugged at her bonnet, pulling it back. She was too focused on the rope, on his muffled curses from below, to notice. Got it, I think. Now. Pull when I say steady now. He scrambled back as she hauled, her arms burning with a sudden, dead weight. The bucket came free, scraping stone, and slammed against the side of the well. Colt got to his feet, dusting dirt and cobwebs from his shirt. Should be... He stopped. Her bonnet had fallen completely back, hanging by its ribbons around her neck. A long, dark strand of her hair, heavy and straight, had escaped its tight bun and was plastered across her cheek with sweat. Nora froze. She knew he was looking. She could feel his eyes on her. She wanted to bolt, to pull the bonnet up, to hide. Colt's expression didn't change. He simply reached out not to her face, but to the rope in her hands. He gently took the rope from her. Good hold, he said, his voice calm. Then he gave the smallest, kindest, most hesitant smile she had ever seen. It was a smile that didn't touch his eyes, just the corner of his mouth. It was a smile that acknowledged the work, not the woman. He turned and began coiling the rope, as if he hadn't seen a thing. Nora, quickly, her fingers trembling, pulled the bonnet back into place, tucking the stray hair away with a savage jab. The incident at the well had been private. The trip to town was public. They needed supplies flour, salt, coffee, and new hinges for the cowshed door. The Henley Mercantile was the only provision store in Mesa Lark, run by a thin, sharp-nosed man named Mr. Henley and his sharper-nosed wife. When Nora entered, her hat pulled low, her scarf high on her face, the store went quiet. Two women, Mrs. Davies and Mrs. Porter, who had been inspecting a bolt of calico, stopped talking, their heads turned, their eyes like identical beads. Nora walked to the counter, her list in her hand. Colt was at the back, testing the weight of the iron hinges. Mr. Henley cleared his throat. Help you, ma'am. Flour, Nora said, keeping her eyes on her list. 20 pounds, and salt. She could hear them whispering behind her, by the calico. The sound was like dry leaves skittering over pavement. The mail order one. Avery's bride. Never shows her face, not once. I heard, the other whispered, leaning in closer, that she's marked, that he got a discount on the passage. Nora's spine went rigid. She could feel the blood drain from her face, leaving her cold under the scarf. She wanted to run. Colt's boots sounded on the floorboards. He walked up behind her, placing the heavy hinges on the counter with a thud that made the women jump. And coffee, Colt said, his voice loud and clear in the small space. A full pound, Mr. Henley, the good kind, and a bag of those peppermint sticks. My wife has a liking for them. He stressed the word wife just enough. He looked directly at Mrs. Davies and Mrs. Porter, his face polite but his eyes as hard as the hinges on the counter. The women flushed. suddenly fascinated by the calico print, and scurried from the store. Nora did not look at him. She kept staring at her list, but her hand, resting on the counter, had stopped shaking. She made one attempt to join the world. The church, a small, white-painted box, held a quilting bee every second Tuesday. Nora baked a pan of molasses cookies and walked the 2 miles alone. When she entered the church basement, the chatter of a dozen women stopped. It was like the mercantile, but amplified by piety. Good afternoon," Nora said, holding out her pan of cookies. I brought these." Maud Ellery, the preacher's wife and the town's self-appointed moral compass, looked up from her quilting frame. "Why, Mrs. Avery, we weren't expecting you." A chair scraped loudly as a woman made space for her, but it was not a welcoming sound. It was the sound of an obligation being met. Nora sat. She tried to join the sewing, but her stitches, usually so neat, were uneven. She could feel the glances. They weren't overt stares, but quick, sharp pecks, like chickens sizing up a newcomer. They looked at her hat, which she kept on. They looked at her gray dress. They whispered behind their hands, their needles all moving in perfect, judgmental rhythm. Must be awful to hide like that. A kindness, really, that Colt Avery took her. Nora stayed for exactly 45 minutes. She sewed one crooked square. When she stood to leave, her cookies were untouched on the side table. "Thank you for having me," she murmured. No one pressed her to stay. The walk home was long, and the wind felt like a slap. That evening, when the cabin was quiet, Nora retrieved the small cedar box she had packed in her bag. It had held her mother's sewing needles. It smelled faintly of cedar and thyme. She took out the folded scraps of paper from Colt. "The north calf is standing east fence mile done. Water's clear." She added the note from their first day. "Welcome, Miss Vale." She found a single, short length of pale blue ribbon at the bottom of her sewing basket. She tied the small stack of notes together, placed them in the box, and shut the lid. She slid the box under her narrow cot. It was her only treasure. It was the only proof that her days here were being counted, not just endured. In the barn, Colt curried the chestnut mare. The rhythmic shh of the brush was soothing, but his mind was on the mercantile, on the untouched cookies she had brought back from the church, which he was now eating. He stopped brushing and leaned his forehead against the mare's warm flank. He rehearsed the words in his head, his lips moving silently. "I need honest, not fancy." He said it over and over. He wasn't practicing it for himself. He was practicing it for her. He was sharpening the words, making them ready. He knew a time would come when she would doubt his bargain, when the whispers from town would get too loud. And when that day came, he would be ready to say it again. He would have the truth waiting for her. "I need honest," he whispered to the horse, "not fancy." On the porch, Nora sat in the one rickety chair, a blanket wrapped around her. The moon was a sliver, the stars a cold, brilliant spray. She had a lap desk and a pen. She was writing a letter to a friend back east, a letter she would never, ever mail. "Dear Elspeth, I have been here 3 weeks. The land is large. It is not beautiful in the way the green hills of home are. It is red and brown and very stark. It is a hard place. The people in the town are not kind. They look at me as if I am a puzzle they are angry they cannot solve. They whisper." She stopped, dipping her pen in the ink. The wind riffled the page. "But the ranch is quiet. Mr. Avery Colt is a quiet man. He does not speak much. But this morning, he left me tea yesterday. He fixed the well. When the women in the store were cruel, he bought me peppermint sticks. It is so very quiet here. Elspeth, but the kindness is loud." Later, the house was dark. The fire in the stove had burned down to embers, a faint red glow. In her room, Nora lay on her cot, her hands clasped over the thin blanket. She was listening. In his room, on the other side of the thin log wall, Colt lay on his bed, his arms folded behind his head. He was listening. The wind, their constant companion, moved around the house. It found a loose shingle on the roof and rattled it. Tap, tap, tap. It pressed against the wooden door of the main room, making the latch click softly in its housing. They both lay awake, staring into their separate darknesses. They listened to the same sounds, the same wind, the same rattling shingle, the same clicking latch. Two people, alone, together, separated only by a wall. The quiet of Sparrow Gulch lasted for another 5 weeks. It was a fragile peace, the kind that exists only in the high country before the first true snow. It was the peace of routine, Nora's biscuits, Colt's mended fences, the shared, silent work of survival. Then the railroad came. They did not arrive with a locomotive's whistle or a crew of loud, soot-stained men. They arrived as 3 riders on tired horses, leading a mule packed with surveying equipment. Colt spotted them from the West Ridge, 3 dark specks moving where no one should be moving. He watched them for an hour, his spyglass cold against his eye. They were not lost. They were not drifting. They were working a line, heading straight for Juniper Run, the creek that fed his cistern and provided the only reliable water for his small herd. By the time he rode down, Nora was standing on the porch, wiping her hands on her apron. She had seen them too. She just pointed. "They're on your land." He rode out, his face set in the hard, impassive lines she had come to recognize. He was gone for 2 hours. When he returned, he did not get off his horse immediately. He just sat, staring at the cabin wall. "They planted stakes," he said, his voice flat. "Red stakes, all along the run." The next day, Silas Brand arrived. He did not look like a man of the territory. He wore a dark, dusty suit and a bowler hat, and he smiled with too many teeth. He rode a sleek bay that looked out of place against the scrub and pinon. He reined in at their fence line, not dismounting, as if he were afraid to touch the Avery land. "Mr. Avery," he called out, his voice oily and confident. "Silas Brand, Rio Palma Railroad." Colt came out onto the porch, Nora a shadow in the doorway behind him. "You're trespassing," Colt said. Brand chuckled, a dry, unpleasant sound. "Am I? I think not." He reached into his coat pocket and produced a sheaf of papers, folded and official-looking. "I have here a grant, sir, a federal grant, signed and sealed, giving the Rio Palma right-of-way and ancillary water rights for 50 yards on either side of our surveyed line." Colt walked down the steps, stopping 10 feet from Brand's horse. "Your line is on my water." "Your water?" Brand feigned surprise. "According to this, it's the railroad's water. Juniper Run is essential for the track-laying crews and, eventually, the steam engines." "This is a deeded ranch," Colt said, his voice dangerously low. "My father filed on this land 30 years ago." "And a fine job he did," Brand smiled. "But a federal grant, Mr. Avery, supersedes a local deed. The railroad is progress. It is the future. This," he waved a dismissive hand at the small cabin, "this is the past." "Get off my land," Colt said. Brand's smile tightened. "I am merely the harbinger. Mr. Avery, the crews will be here by the end of the month to begin diverting the run. Our line requires a solid bed, and that little creek of yours makes the ground too soft." "You divert that water," Colt said, "and you kill this ranch." "Precisely," Brand said, though his face registered nothing. "Which is why the Rio Palma is prepared to make you a fair offer. 4 bits an acre, more than this scrub is worth. You can't farm without water. Avery, we both know that. Sell now. Take your wife." He glanced at the shadow in the doorway. "And find easier land elsewhere." "I said," Colt repeated, taking 1 step closer. "Get off my land." The smile vanished. Silas Brand gathered his reins. "You will be hearing from our lawyers. Good day, sir." He wheeled the bay horse and rode off, leaving the red stakes behind him, planted in the mud of Juniper Run like a row of fresh, unholy wounds. The tension in the cabin that night was a physical thing. It was in the way Colt stared into the fire, his jaw working. It was in the way Nora's hands gripped her teacup, her knuckles white. The real fight, however, began not with water, but with words. They had to go to town for salt and lamp oil. Mesa Lark was buzzing. Brand and his men had set up in the saloon, buying rounds and talking loudly about the coming railroad, the jobs it would bring, the prosperity. The town, desperate for any good news, was eating it up. Colt went into the mercantile, leaving Nora on the buckboard seat, as was their custom. She kept her hat low, her gaze fixed on the worn leather of the reins. "Well now, what have we here?" The voice was rough, slurred with whiskey. Nora flinched. Two men from the saloon had wandered over. They wore the same dusty trail clothes as the local hands, but their belt buckles were new and their swagger was different. They were Brand's men. "That's Avery's woman," the first one said, grinning. "The one who don't show her face." Nora shrank, pulling her hat brim down so far it touched the scarf at her mouth. "Hey now, ma'am," the second man slurred, stepping closer, putting a dirty hand on the wagon wheel. "What's the secret? Why you always hiding?" He leaned in, his breath a foul wave of liquor and onions. "What's under that hat? You got a pig snout, a missing eye?" Nora was paralyzed. She was back in the factory, the air thick with cotton dust and the jeers of the other girls. She was 13, her face still raw from the accident. She couldn't breathe. "You got a hat pulled low on account of what?" the man taunted, his hand reaching out as if to flick the brim. "That's far enough." Colt's voice. It wasn't loud. It wasn't a shout. It was a low, flat command, as cold and final as a spadeful of winter earth. The man froze, his hand in the air. Colt was standing on the boardwalk, a heavy sack of salt in one hand. He hadn't run. He had just appeared. He placed the sack gently in the wagon bed, his movements deliberate. "She's Avery ranch stock," Colt said, his eyes on the man. "She's not for you to bother. Move along." "Now, Avery, we was just being friendly," the first man started, trying to laugh it off. "I said, move along." Colt didn't raise his hand to the gun on his hip. He didn't need to. The promise was in his stance, in the absolute stillness of his shoulders. He was a man who owned the ground he stood on, and these men were just drifting dust. The taunter's face soured. He looked at his friend, at Colt, and back at Nora's hidden form. With a final curse, he spat in the dirt near the wheel. "Suit yourself. Sodbuster. Gonna be mighty thirsty soon. Anyway." They swaggered back to the saloon, their laughter forced and ugly. Colt climbed onto the seat without a word. He clicked his tongue, and the mare started for home. The silence in the wagon was worse than the men's voices. Nora was trembling, a fine, violent tremor that shook her whole body. She was ashamed of the men, ashamed of her fear, ashamed of the face that had caused it. Colt kept his eyes on the road, his knuckles white on the reins. He was furious, but his anger was a cold, hard stone in his gut. He was angry at Brand, at the men, at a world that would kick a thing just to see if it was weak. He said nothing. There was nothing to say that wouldn't make it worse. That Sunday was the monthly circuit preacher's visit. It was an obligation. To not show up would be a statement, a sign of weakness, and Colt Avery would not be seen as weak. Nora baked. It was all she knew to do. She made a pan of dark, sticky molasses cakes. Her hands were steady as she measured the flour, the ginger, the molasses. This was work. This was real. They walked into the small church hall, which was already crowded and buzzing like a nest of disturbed hornets. The talk was all of Brand, the railroad, and the water. When Colt and Nora entered, The buzzing changed. It dipped, became softer, more pointed. Nora took her pan of cakes to the refreshment table. Set against the back wall, the other women, Mrs. Davies, Mrs. Porter, and Maud Ellery. The preacher's wife were arranging their own pies and breads. They nodded at Nora. It was a cold, brittle acknowledgement. Mrs. Avery, Maud said, her voice dripping with false piety. So good of you to come. We've all been so worried about the news, about the water. It is a concern, Nora said, her voice barely a whisper. She kept her head down, arranging her cakes on a platter. Yes, indeed. Mrs. Davies chimed in, not looking at Nora but at the other women. Must be awful, having that Mr. Brand right on your doorstep, making such claims. The gossip was thick as smoke. They were picking at the wound, testing the limits of the Avery's misfortune. Nora could feel their eyes on her hat, on her scarf. Today, their curiosity felt more hostile than ever, sharpened by the saloon confrontation everyone had heard about. Her hands began to shake. She held the heavy platter, the small squares of dark cake trembling with her. She would not drop it. She would not. She turned to leave the table, to find a seat in the corner. As she passed the open doorway, a sudden, violent gust of wind, a caprice of the high plains, shot through the hall. It caught the wide brim of her hat. She raised a hand to stop it, but she was too late. The platter was in her other hand. The wind was too strong. It lifted the brim, flipping it straight up and back, holding it there for 1, 2, 3 agonizing seconds. The buzzing in the room stopped, utterly. The light from the door was cruel. It illuminated the left side of her face, the side she always kept hidden. It was not a pig's snout. It was not a missing eye. It was a mark, a deep, jagged splash of crimson, like a wine stain, that covered her cheek from the corner of her eye down to her jawline. And running through it, from her temple to her chin, was a thin, silvery white scar, the relic of a spinning shuttle from a Lowell textile mill, a scar from an accident she had not caused. It was, in the harsh, judgmental light of the church hall, shocking. For a long moment, no one moved, no one breathed. They just stared. Then, from the corner, a young woman, Liza Porter, barely 17, giggled, a short, sharp, unstoppable sound of cruel amusement. The sound broke the spell. Nora's hand, the one that had failed to stop the wind, moved. She calmly reached up and pulled the hat brim back down, seating it firmly, low over her brow. Her hand was no longer shaking. She turned, walked back to the refreshment table, and set the platter of molasses cakes down. The thud on the wood was deliberate. She straightened her back. She looked, not at any one of them, but at the center of the room. Her voice, when she spoke, was not a whisper. It was clear, and it carried molasses cakes. She said, "Take one if you want. I'm going home." She turned and walked out of the church. She did not run. Her back was as straight as a rifle barrel. Colt, who had been standing by the wall, watched her go. He saw the giggle. He saw her face. He saw her spine. A strange, fierce, terrible pride bloomed in his chest. He turned and followed her out, leaving the stunned, silent hall behind him. She was already 100 yards down the track, walking fast. Her strides were long and angry. "Nora!" he called. She didn't stop. He caught up to her, but he didn't grab her arm. He just walked beside her, his longer legs easily matching her furious pace. He could feel the hurt and humiliation coming off her in waves, like heat from a forge. He knew, with a certainty that ached, that there was nothing he could say. "It don't matter" was a lie. It did matter. Their fools was true, but it didn't heal the wound. So he said nothing. He just walked with her. He walked the whole 2 miles back to the ranch, matching her step for step, a silent, grim escort. He could not catch her hurt, but he could walk with it. That night, The cabin was a fortress of silence. Nora made supper. They ate. The air was thick with the unsaid after. Nora sat mending a shirt, her stitches small and tight, as if she were sewing her own skin back together. Colt paced. He went to the porch, stared at the dark line of hills, and came back in. He was a man of action, and there was no action to take. He couldn't fight a giggle. He couldn't shoot a rumor. Finally, he unrolled his father's old land maps on the kitchen table. They were cracked and yellowed, drawn in faded ink. He lit a second lamp, his brow furrowed, tracing the line of Juniper Run with a calloused finger. "He's going to choke us," Colt said to the map. "If he diverts it, we'll be dry in a month." He pressed his fingers to his temples. "There's nowhere else for the water to come from." Nora stopped sewing. Her needle hung suspended in the cloth. She did not look up. "Yes, there is," she said. Colt looked at her. "What?" "There is," she repeated. She put her sewing aside and stood up. She walked to the table, her shadow falling across the map. She did not look at him. She looked at the paper. Her finger, pale and scarred, touched the map. She pointed to a series of faint contour lines about half a mile east of the run. The map marked it as a dry wash, a dead arroyo. "Here," she said, "the map is wrong. It's not a wash. It's a channel. That's been dry for 20 years. Nora, my father said it dried up in the long drought." "It's not dry," she said, her voice certain. "It's just buried. When I walk, I've been walking. The ground there is different. The greasewood grows thicker. The roots are finding water." She traced a line with her fingernail, a line that bypassed Brand's red stakes and curved back toward their cistern. The Navajo knew it. You can see the old stones they used to line the banks. If you dig, it's silted up, but the water is still under there. It's just waiting. Colt stared at the map, then at her finger, then at the map again. He grabbed his hat. "Get the lantern." For the first time since she had arrived, they were not a man and a woman, a rancher and his mail-order bride. They were not two strangers bound by an awkward contract. They were two farmers, and they were looking at their land. "If we can dig it out," he said, his voice rough with a new, sudden hope. "If we can clear that silt before Brand builds his dam." "We can," Nora said, finally looking up. Her hat was off. Her hair was pulled back. Her marked, scarred face was illuminated by the lamp, and her eyes were fierce. "We can, but we have to start tonight." He nodded, a sharp, quick motion. The next morning, as the sun's first light hit the east pasture, Colt saw it. The fence was cut, 3, 4, 5 wires, snipped clean with shears. His 3 new calves, the ones he and Nora had spent a week nursing, were gone, scattered into the canyons, a gift for the coyotes. It was no longer a legal fight. It was no longer a war of words. Silas Brand had drawn his line. Now, Colt Avery would draw his. The calves were gone. The cut wires of the fence were like severed nerves, twitching in the morning wind. Colt had spent the day riding the canyons, his face a mask of cold fury. He found one calf, its leg broken, and had been forced to put it down. The other 2 had vanished, claimed by the vast, indifferent landscape or by Brand's men. That night, the cabin was silent, but it was a new kind of silence. It wasn't the awkward quiet of strangers. It was the heavy, loaded silence of 2 people girding for a war. Colt sat at the table, cleaning his rifle, the snick-snick of the oiled rag the only sound. Nora sat across from him, her own work laid out. Not mending, she was writing. She had her lap desk, her small bottle of ink, and the pages of her unsent letter to Elspeth. The lamplight fell on the paper, and on her marked cheek, which she no longer bothered to hide from him. Not since the church. Not since she had shown him the map. "Dear Elspeth," she wrote, her pen scratching in the quiet. "You asked me why I left. I told you it was for opportunity. That was a lie, or not a lie, but a shadow of the truth. I did not leave for opportunity. I left because I had no other place to go. Colt glanced up. He watched her hand move across the page. He saw the set of her jaw. She was in another place, another time. He went back to his rifle, giving her the privacy of her own thoughts. You remember I worked at the Lowell Creek Mill after Father passed. You remember the noise, the way the cotton dust hung in the air like a kind of snow that never melted. I was content, or I thought I was. I was to be married, Elspeth, to Joseph Hart. He was a foreman. He smelled of machine oil and starch, and I believed that was the scent of a secure future. Then came the fire. It was a Tuesday. A line boss had let the carding machines run too hot, too fast. The dust in the air didn't just hang. It exploded. I remember the sound, a great whoomph that blew the windows out. And then the screaming. I got out. I was by a stairwell. I got out into the yard with the others, my ears ringing, my lungs full of smoke. And then I heard it, a small sound, a child's cry. It was little Sarah, the Doffer girl, not more than 10. She was trapped on the 3rd floor, her leg caught in the wreckage of a spinning frame. The exit was blocked by a wall of burning bales. The men were shouting, but no one was going back in. The roof was already groaning. I don't know why I did it. Elspeth, it wasn't bravery. It was just a thing that had to be done. I wrapped a wet rag around my face and I went back in. The heat was like a physical hand, pushing me back. The air was orange and black. I found her. Her pinafore was on fire. I put it out with my hands. I tore her leg free from the machine. The main beam overhead was crackling. As I pulled her up, a piece of the tin roof, red hot, fell from the ceiling. It struck the side of my face. I don't remember the pain, not then. I just remember the smell of burnt metal and me. I threw her over my shoulder and I ran for the window. I dropped her down to the men below. And then I jumped. My leg broke on the landing. But that wasn't the worst of it. Nora stopped writing. Her hand was shaking. She put the pen down, her knuckles white. She could feel the phantom heat, the ghost of the pain. She touched the scar on her cheek, the long, silvery line that ran through the dark crimson birthmark. The fire had changed the mark I was born with. The doctor said the burn was so deep, it cooked the skin, darkened the pigment forever, and the cut from the tin, that was the scar. Joseph came to see me at the infirmary. Once, my head was wrapped in bandages. He stood by the door. He wouldn't come closer. He kept turning his hat in his hands. He said, "The mill's a total loss. They're not rebuilding." He was worried about his job. I was worried about my face. When they took the bandages off, a week later, my landlady held the mirror. I didn't recognize myself. The woman in the glass was a monster, a thing from a nightmare. The scar was raw, and the mark was the color of a fresh bruise. Joseph came by that evening. I was sitting on the porch, so the neighbors wouldn't have to see me in the light. He stood on the bottom step. He wouldn't look at me, not directly. He just looked at the rotted boards by his feet. And he said I remember the exact words. "Elspeth," he said. "Nora, I'm a man with prospects. I need a wife who can stand beside me at company socials. That face, it just doesn't suit my future." He left. He didn't say goodbye. He just left. So you see, I wasn't running to opportunity. I was running from the pity, from the stares, from the whispers. I was running from a world that had no place for a woman with a face that didn't suit a man's future. I took what little money I had, and I answered an advertisement in a church paper, an advertisement from a man in the New Mexico territory, a man who needed an honest woman, and didn't mention a thing about her being pretty. I came west on a train. Elspeth. It was so cold. I sat in the 3rd-class car for 6 days, and I felt that cold seep right into my bones. It felt just like Joseph's last words, cold and hard and final. She closed the lap desk. She would not cry. She had burned all her tears out in that fire. She looked at Colt He was squinting at a tiny screw on the rifle's lever action. His tongue stuck out in concentration. He was 1,000,000 miles away, lost in his own world of metal and wood. He finished, satisfied. He set the rifle down. He looked at her, then at her lap desk. He knew she was writing her secrets. The thought made him stand up, uncomfortable. He walked to the kitchen cupboard, the one by the stove. He opened it. Inside, on the bottom shelf, was a battered tin box, the kind that held expensive cigars. He took it out and brought it to the table, setting it down under the lamp. It was dented, and the lid was rusted at the hinges. Nora watched him. This was a ritual she had not seen. He opened it. The squeak of the lid was loud in the room. There wasn't much inside: a tarnished silver dollar, a dried eagle feather, and a folded piece of paper, a formal betrothal certificate. It was torn, almost in half, the tear running right through the signatures. Colt picked it up, unfolding it as gently as if it were a dead bird. Her name was Annabelle. He said. Nora's hands froze in her lap. He wasn't talking to the room. He was talking to her. She was from Santa Fe. Her father was a merchant. She was fancy, he said, the word sounding like a curse. She liked silk ribbons and pearl buttons. I thought I was lucky. I thought she was everything. He stared at the torn paper, his eyes distant. We were to be married. I brought her here. My father had just died. This place, the deed, was all I had. She lasted 1 month. She hated the wind. She hated the silence. She hated that the dirt wasn't clean. He paused, his thumb rubbing the torn edge of the paper. She had a brother, a gambler, liked cards and whiskey, and he was always 1 step ahead of the men he'd cheated. He showed up here, said he was just visiting his dear sister. He stayed for a week. The day they left, the day she left, she told me she was going to town for supplies. I was out mending the same damn fence Bran just cut. He let out a short, harsh breath. When I came back, she was gone. So was the brother, and so was the deed to this ranch. Nora's eyes widened. She took it. She stole it, Colt said, his voice flat. Stole it and gave it to her brother, so he could use it as collateral in a poker game in Tucson. Took me 6 months to get it back, cost me every cent I had, and the best 20 head of cattle my father had raised. I found the certificate in the ashes of the fireplace. She'd tried to burn it before she left. She didn't even do that right. He refolded the paper. He looked at Nora, his eyes clear and hard, but not unkind. That's why I wrote what I did in the advertisement. Nora, I'm done with fancy. Fancy lies, fancy steals, fancy runs when the work gets hard. He leaned forward, his rough hands flat on the table. I don't need gentle all the time. I don't need pretty. I need true. After yesterday, after what you did in that church and what you found on that map that was true. Nora swallowed. The heat in the room felt suffocating. She thought of her letter, of the face that didn't suit a man's future. What if, she whispered, her voice catching. What if my true isn't enough? What if this face, what if it's too much to ask a man to live with? It was the question she had carried for 1,000 miles, the question that had lived under her skin like a parasite. Colt looked at her. He didn't look at her scar or her birthmark. He looked at her eyes. Nora, he said, his voice quiet but as solid as the rock outside. We're ranchers. We know about lacking. If the crop is thin, we fertilize. If the wood is warped, we brace it. If the water's low, we dig a new channel. He tapped the table with 1 finger. We can fix most anything that's lacking. We can fix a broken fence. We can fix a dry well. The only thing we can't fix, the only thing that'll kill you out here is a lack of truth. He closed the lid of his tin box. Nora sat in the silence, letting his words settle over her. They were not soft words. They were not poetry. They were hard, practical, and honest. They were the truest words anyone had ever said to her. She stood, went to her cot, and pulled out the small cedar box, the one with her mother's needles, the one with his notes tied in blue ribbon. She brought it back to the table. It looked small and fine next to his battered tin box. She didn't open it. She didn't have to. She just set it on the table beside his. A silent confession, a shared trust. Here is my secret. Here is my past. It sits next to yours. Colt looked at her box, then at his. He nodded once. He picked up his tin box and walked to the kitchen cupboard. He placed it back on the bottom shelf. Then he held his hand out for hers. Nora gave him the cedar box. He placed it carefully on the shelf, right next to the tin. He closed the cupboard door. Their secrets were now put away, together, in the same darkness. The air in the cabin changed. The tension of the last few days didn't disappear, but it shifted. It was no longer a man and a woman in a house. It was a partnership. The next morning, Nora was outside, scattering feed for the chickens, when Colt came out of the barn with the mare. "Nora!" he called. He put 2 fingers to his lips and let out a sharp, 2-note whistle, high and clear. The mare, who had been ambling toward the trough, stopped and turned her head. Her ears pricked. "That's how I call her," he said. "If you're ever in trouble, if you ever need her, you do that." Nora watched him. She put her own fingers to her mouth, but her attempt was just a rush of empty air. Colt smiled. A real smile this time, not the hesitant twitch she'd seen at the well. It lit up his eyes. "No, like this. Curl your tongue. Press it up." He showed her again. She tried. A small squeaking sound came out. He laughed, a short, rusty bark of a sound. "You sound like a wet prairie dog." "Keep trying. She'll learn your version of it." All that afternoon, as she weeded the small kitchen garden, she practiced. A series of strange hisses and squeaks filled the air, until finally, late in the day, she managed a sound that was almost the whistle. The mare, grazing by the fence, lifted her head and looked right at her. Nora gasped. And then, for the first time since she'd left the East, she smiled. That evening, he came in late from digging at the new channel, his hands caked in mud, his shoulders slumped with exhaustion. She had a hot meal waiting. As she turned her back to him to get the bread, she felt him fumbling with the strings of her apron. What are you doing?" she asked, freezing. "This knot," he mumbled, his voice thick with frustration. It's tighter than a mule's hitch." His large, clumsy fingers, so adept with rope and leather, were utterly defeated by the simple bow. "Colt, I got it," he insisted. He was clumsy, but he was patient. He worked at the knot, his knuckles brushing her back. His touch was not familiar, not intimate. It was determined, like he was fixing a piece of stubborn tack. After a full minute, the knot came free. "There," he said, sounding far too proud of himself. "Thank you," she whispered, her back still to him. Just makes sense," he muttered, heading to the wash basin. "You tie it, I untie it. Partnership." Later that night, long after Colt was asleep, Nora stood by the main window. The moon was bright, and it turned the yard into a landscape of silver and black. She didn't look out. She looked at the glass. The window was old, the glass wavy and imperfect. It gave back a reflection, a dark, distorted image of her own face. The moonlight was just bright enough to catch the lines of it. She saw the shadow of her birthmark. She saw the faint, pale line of the scar. She saw the set of her mouth, the weariness in her eyes. The woman in the glass was not pretty. Joseph Hart had been right about that. But she was not the trembling, hidden creature who had stepped off the stagecoach. The woman in the glass was straight-backed. Her shoulders were square. Her eyes were clear. She was not pretty, but she was upright. She was still standing. She let the curtain fall. She was about to turn to her cot when a glint of red, far out in the moonlight, caught her eye. She pulled the curtain back. On the ridge, beyond their fence line, where the land sloped down toward Brand's surveyed path, were new stakes. Not one or two, a dozen. They were no longer just at the creek. They were creeping up the hill. Brand's men had been busy. The little red stakes marched across the pasture. A line of fresh, toxic mushrooms sprouted after a rain. They were closer, much closer. The war was no longer at their borders. It was in their yard. The red stakes planted by Silas Brand were a declaration of war, but the land, it seemed, had its own battle plan. The sky had been a sickly yellow-gray for 2 days, the air heavy and still. The wind, usually a constant, irritable companion, had died completely, leaving a vacuum that felt pressurized and wrong. Colt and Nora worked on the new channel, their shovels sinking into the damp, heavy earth. They worked with the grim, silent efficiency of people who knew their time was running out. Brand's men were on the far ridge, watching. The railroad was waiting. Then, at nearly 4 o'clock on the second day, the sky broke open. It was not a rain. It was a deluge, a vertical flood. The heavens simply unzipped. The first drops were the size of silver dollars, hitting the dry-packed earth with sounds like drumbeats. Within 5 minutes, the world was obscured by a solid, deafening curtain of water. The sound on the cabin's tin roof was not a patter. It was a continuous, frantic roar, like 1,000 hammers beating a desperate rhythm. "The mare!" Colt yelled over the noise, already running for the barn. "The channel!" Nora shouted, grabbing a lantern, though it was afternoon. They worked for an hour in the blinding chaos. The sky as dark as dusk. The dry arroyos, which had been pathways of dust and lizards, became liquid roads of churning, red-brown mud. The new channel they had dug, their secret hope, was instantly overwhelmed, collapsing into a muddy soup. They were hauling the last of the chickens into the barn when they heard it. Through the roar of the rain, another sound, faint, desperate, and metallic. Clang, 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 clang. The church bell, but it wasn't the steady ring for Sunday service. It was a frantic, terrified, irregular slamming, the sound of disaster. "The wash," Colt said, his face instantly pale beneath the grime. He didn't say another word. He threw the saddle on the chestnut mare, his hands moving with blurred speed. Nora, soaked to the bone, her gray dress clinging to her like a second skin, simply ran to the buckboard and grabbed the heavy tow rope. She didn't ask to come. She just followed. They rode, Colt on the mare and Nora driving the buckboard, toward the sound. The track was a river. When they reached the high bank of Boxwood Wash, the sight below them was an image from a nightmare. Boxwood Wash, normally a 20-foot wide ribbon of sand and scrub, was now 100-yard wide, churning brown sea. The water was not water. It was liquid earth, thick with silt, torn up branches, and the debris of a landscape being violently erased. And in the middle of it, lodged hard against a massive outcrop of rock, was the small wagon from the church, the kid wagon. It was Maud Ellery, the preacher's wife. She had taken her Tuesday Bible class on a picnic up in the high meadows, ignoring the threatening sky. Now, she was paying the price. She was frantically lashing the reins, but the mule was terrified, its eyes white, braying in pure animal panic. The water was already sloshing over the wagon bed. And behind her, huddled together, were 4 children. Nora recognized them from the church. Eliza Porter's little brother, Timothy, and the 2 Davies twins. They were screaming, but their screams were stolen by the roar of the flood. The entire town seemed to be on the bank. Ronan Shaw, the blacksmith, Mr. Henley, Mrs. Davies, who was on her knees in the mud, shrieking her children's names, and Silas Brand, who was there too, watching from horseback on a high, dry piece of ground, an impassive observer to the town's unfolding tragedy. "They're wedged," Ronan yelled at Colt as he rode up. "The axle's caught on the granite. We can't get a line to 'em." Colt didn't answer. He spurred the mare, forcing her down the slick, muddy bank and into the raging water. The mare fought him, rearing as the cold, fast water hit her chest. "Easy, girl, easy," Colt roared. He pushed her forward. The water rose instantly, to the mare's knees, to her belly. She was swimming now, her powerful legs churning, but the current was immense. It tried to sweep her sideways. The wagon was 30 yards away. Colt uncoiled his lariat, swinging it, trying to reach Maud. The rope was heavy with rain. It fell short, a pathetic splash 10 feet from the wagon. "It's no good," he yelled. "The current's too fast, I can't." He saw the wagon lurch. The rock it was pinned on was giving way. The water was creating a whirlpool, a vortex that was eating the bank away from under the wheels. They didn't have minutes. They had seconds. He looked at the bank. Nora was gone. He panicked, his head whipping around, searching the crowd. Then he saw her. She was 20 yards upstream, on the bank. She had already kicked off her heavy, soaked boots. They lay on their sides in the red mud. She was tying the end of the heavy tow rope, the one from the buckboard, around her waist. Her hands quick and sure, the knots non-negotiable. "Nora," he bellowed. "No, the water's too cold, it'll take you." She didn't look at him. She was tying up her heavy wool skirt, bunching it high on her thighs, tucking it into the rope at her waist. She looked like a woman preparing for laundry, not a woman preparing to swim for her life. The rope, tied around her thin waist, looked less like a tool and more like a final prayer. She handed the other end of the rope to Ronan Shaw. "Hold me," she commanded, her voice clear and sharp, cutting through the din. "Don't pull, just hold." Before anyone could argue, she ran, 2 stumbling steps, and dove, not into the water, but through it. She aimed for the current, hitting it with a flat, shallow dive that took her deep. She vanished. Colt's heart stopped. The rope in Ronan's hands went taut. A living thing. "She's gone, missus," Davies screamed. Then, 10 yards out, her head broke the surface. She was gasping, her hair plastered to her face, but she was swimming. She was not a strong swimmer, not graceful. She was a fighter. She swam with her head down, digging, pulling, kicking. The current grabbed her, tried to pull her downstream, but she fought it, clawing her way across the brown torrent, aided by the anchor rope at her waist. She reached the wagon, her hands grabbing the sideboard with a desperate, slapping sound. Maud Ellery just stared at her, her face a mask of white, frozen terror. The rope!" Nora gasped, clinging to the side. She was already numb with cold. It's stuck!" Maud shrieked. "We're going to die." "No, we're not," Nora spat, her voice fierce. She looked at the children. Little Timothy Porter was catatonic, his eyes wide, his mouth open in a silent scream. She unhooked the safety line from her waist. "Hold this," she ordered Maud. "Do not let go." She looked at Colt, who was holding his mare steady in the chest-deep water, his face agonized. He had his own rope. The lariat. Nora pointed at it, then at the wagon's front axle, then at her own waist. He understood. He threw his lariat. She caught it. The water was too deep, the current too strong, for him to get his horse any closer. Nora secured the lariat to the rope Maud was holding, then turned her attention to the children. She pulled Timothy Porter to her, wrapping her arms around his small, shaking body. She pressed his face into her shoulder, shielding him from the spray and the terrifying sight of the water. "Listen to me," she commanded, her mouth to his ear. The roar of the water was deafening, a physical weight. "You have to breathe. You will not cry. You will breathe. With me. Now." She forced her own lungs to work, to set a rhythm. "1," she said, her voice a low growl. 2, 3, breathe in. 1, 2, 3, breathe out. Again. Do it." The boy, shocked by her intensity, gasped and obeyed. He clung to her, his small fingers digging into her arms. "I have to go under the water," she yelled to Maud over the boy's head. Hold the rope! Hold the boy! She gave Timothy to Maud, then took a heaving breath and disappeared under the churning, opaque water. It was black and cold, a freezing high-speed night. She was blind, her hands out. The current tried to rip her from the wagon, to suck her under the wheels. She felt the axle, slick with silt. She pulled the heavy lariat down, her lungs burning. She fumbled with the rope, her fingers numb, like clumsy wooden pegs. She had to loop it. She had to make it hold. She looped it, pulled the end through, and yanked it tight, using the current's own force to lock the knot. She burst out of the water, gagging, her lungs on fire. She spit out a mouthful of mud and grit. "It's set!" she screamed at Colt, waving her arm. Pull now!" Colt roared. It was not a human sound. It was a primal bellow of rage and effort. He spurred the mare, turning her back toward the bank, the rope his rope, now looped through the axle by her snapped taut, rising from the water like a steel bar. The mare screamed as the weight hit her. Her front hooves lifted off the creek bed. "Pull!" Colt roared, striking the mare with his hat. "Pull, you devil!" The gun on his arms and neck stood out like wet ropes. The muscles in his shoulders bunched, and the back of his wet shirt tore, the fabric giving way with a sound like a gunshot. The wagon groaned. It scraped on the rock, a sound that set Nora's teeth on a... "Again!" Nora screamed. Colt backed the mare 2 steps, then hit her again. The horse lunged, all her weight against the saddle horn. The wagon moved. It jumped, the front wheels lifting free of the rock that had trapped it. The whirlpool grabbed it, spinning it sideways, but the rope held. It was free. A massive unified cheer erupted from the bank. Colt didn't stop. He kept the mare moving, dragging the wagon, scraping and bumping, through the shallower, but still fast, water toward the safety of the bank. The wagon was almost safe. The crowd was surging forward. Colt, his job done, swung his leg over the saddle to dismount, to help with the children. His boot hit a loose, algae-slick boulder under the water. He slipped. It was a simple, stupid mistake. He went down, vanishing instantly. The current, which he had defeated, grabbed him. His hat bobbed to the surface, and then he was gone, pulled toward the main, violent channel. Nora, who had been lifting Timothy out of the wagon, didn't hesitate. She didn't think, she reacted. She leaped from the wagon, not toward the bank, but at him. She hit the water and lunged, intercepting his body as it was being swept away. She didn't try to grab him. She didn't try to lift him. She was too small, too tired. She shoved him. She put her shoulder down and used her last ounce of strength, a desperate, violent push, driving him sideways, out of the main current and toward the slick, muddy bank. The effort cost her everything. Her feet found no purchase. The force of the push sent her backward, into the current he had just vacated. She went under, swallowing a lungful of the filthy, freezing floodwater. She gagged, her body convulsing, as she was tumbled, helpless, toward the bank. She hit the mud on her hands and knees, coughing violently, spitting up foul, muddy water, her body retching. She collapsed. She lay on her side in the red mud, every muscle screaming, unable to move. The rain, which had lessened to a drizzle, was cold on her face. A moment later, Colt collapsed beside her. He had scrambled the last few feet onto the bank. He, too, was done. They lay side by side under the dark, dripping branches of a cypress tree, 2 feet apart, 2 ruined, mud-caked, exhausted creatures. The sounds of the rescue of crying children being reunited with frantic parents, of Maud Ellery babbling thanks to God, of Ronan Shaw bellowing orders seemed to come from 1,000,000 miles away. All Nora could hear was the roar of the water and the frantic rabbit thump of her own heart, and the sound of Cold Avery gasping for breath beside her. Sweat, rain, mud, They were baptized in it. He rolled his head, his cheek grinding in the grit, to look at her. She was a wreck. Her hair was a tangled mat of leaves and silt. Her face was streaked, the red birthmark and the white scar visible beneath the mud, no worse or better than the rest of the dirt. She was just her. His own hand was shaking, a tremor of adrenaline and cold. He reached across the small space between them. He didn't pat her. He didn't try to help her up. He simply laid his hand, palm down, on the back of her hand, which was resting in the mud. His hand was heavy. It was not a lover's caress. It was not a gesture of pity. It was a statement. It was an anchor. It was a touch that said, "I am here. You are here. We are real." Nora didn't flinch. She didn't pull away. She just closed her eyes, and for the first time let her own shaking hand be still under the steady, solid weight of his. That night, the storm finally rumbled away, heading east, leaving a cold, clear, star-filled sky in its wake. The cabin was warm. The fire in the stove was stoked high, its light glowing red through the grate. A line was strung from one wall to the other. On it hung Colt's ripped shirt, her gray wool dress, and their underthings, all dripping and steaming in the dry heat. They sat at the table, wrapped in heavy wool blankets. They were drinking hot, sweet coffee. They had not spoken more than 10 words since they'd returned. There was nothing to say. Their bodies ached. Their hands were raw. The fire was a living thing in the room, a heart that was slowly, steadily, pushing the cold out of their bones. The news, of course, traveled faster than the floodwaters. It was all over Mesa Lark by morning. Maud Ellery, the preacher's wife, was telling everyone in the mercantile how she had been saved. She spoke of the water, the terror, and the woman who had dived under the wagon. Mrs. Davies, who had once whispered about Nora's marked face, was now telling everyone, loudly, that Mrs. Avery had held her children's hands. And Eliza Porter, the girl who had giggled in the church hall, was silent. Her little brother, Timothy, was telling anyone who would listen that Mrs. Avery had taught him how to breathe, and that she had held him, and that she was not scary at all. The whispers in Mesa Lark had to change. The old story, the one about the plain bride and the woman who hid her face, was dead. It had been washed away. The new story, the one that was repeated over and over, was about the woman who swam Boxwood Wash. The red stakes of Silas Brand were still on the hill, but the social map of the town had just been violently and permanently redrawn. The rescue at Boxwood Wash had changed the sound of Mesa Lark, the whispers that had once followed Nora Vale like stray. Biting dogs were now replaced by a respectful quiet, or by overt, fumbling kindness. Mrs. Davies, whose children Nora had helped pull from the water, now insisted on giving her the best cut of bacon at the mercantile. Timothy Porter, the boy she had taught to breathe through his panic, ran up to her near the smithy, pressed a small, wilted prairie flower into her hand, and bolted away before she could speak. She was, for the first, humbled gratitude. However, was not the same as acceptance. The town's hierarchy had been challenged, and its self-appointed guardian, Maud Ellery, did not approve. Maud had seen her own narrative, the one of the pitiable, marked woman swept away by the flood. Her own terror, her own screaming helplessness in that wagon, had been witnessed by the entire town. Nora, the woman Maud had scorned, had been the one to dive under the water. This reversal was intolerable. The Mesa Lark Gazette, a 4-page sheet of town gossip, inflated mercantile prices, and Maud's sour observations, came out the following Friday. Colt brought it back from town along with a sack of grain. He left it on the kitchen table, folded in a way that suggested he hadn't read it, or, more likely, in a way that he hoped she wouldn't. Nora found it when she cleared away the supper dishes. She unfolded it. There, on the 3rd page, was a crude, hastily drawn caricature. It wasn't of the flood. It wasn't a tribute to the rescue. It was a drawing of a woman in a severe gray dress, her face completely obscured by a hat as wide as a wagon wheel. But in this version, the artist had drawn the brim tilted up just slightly, revealing a mouth that was a cruel, lopsided slash. The caption beneath it read, "The wide-brimmed bride, a smile askew." Nora's stomach went cold. She had saved Maud's child, and this was her payment. She had faced the flood, and now she was being drowned in ink. The town might respect her actions, but its voice, its press, still insisted on reminding her of her place. She felt the old shame rise, hot and acidic in her throat. She calmly folded the paper, slid it deep into the kindling box, and put the lid on. She would not let Colt see that it had found its mark. The harvest fair was 2 nights later. It was the first real celebration since the flood, and the town was desperate for a return to normalcy. The main plaza, usually a sea of brown dust, was transformed. Lanterns yellow and orange were strung in lazy loops between the mercantile and the land office. The air, for once, was not filled with grit, but with the sharp, sweet smell of roasting apples and spiced cider. From a raised platform near the blacksmith's, a trio of musicians, a fiddle, a harmonica, and a banjo played a fast, thumping reel. "We don't have to stay," Colt said. He stood beside her at the edge of the light. He had seen the way her hand tightened on her shawl as she looked at the crowd. She had spent a full hour getting ready. She wore her best dress, the same gray wool, but she had pressed it with a hot iron. She had left the neckerchief at home, and her hat, the wide-brimmed shield, was tilted back on her head. A small, terrifying act of defiance that left her marked cheek exposed to the lantern light. "We do," she said, her voice tight. "We need flour, and we need to be here. Silas Brand is here." She was right. Brand was standing on the porch of the Dusty Bell Saloon, watching the festivities with a proprietary air, as if he already owned the town, its music and its people. "All right," Colt said, "but you stay close." They walked into the light. The change was immediate. Ronan Shaw, the blacksmith, saw them, put down his mug, and tipped his hat. "Mr. Avery, ma'am." It was a greeting of deep, profound respect. "Mrs. Davies rushed over, her face beaming. "Mrs. Avery, you must try my apple pie. I saved you a piece. The first piece." Nora was so flustered she could only nod. This was new. This was a warmth she had never expected. She felt Colt relax beside her. Maybe the Gazette was just Maud, not the town. They walked toward the mercantile, past a group of young, rowdy ranch hands who were drinking from a shared bottle. As Nora passed, her face turned toward the light. One of them, his courage bolstered by liquor, caught sight of her. His eyes widened. He hadn't seen her this clearly before. He nudged his friend. "Well, I'll be," the man drawled, his voice carrying clearly over a lull in the banjo music. "It's the smile askew from the Gazette. Looks like Maud got the drawing just right." A short, sharp burst of drunken laughter followed. It was the giggle from the church. It was the whisper in the mercantile. It was every cruel stare she had ever endured. Nora froze. Her body went rigid. Every instinct, every fiber of her being screamed at her to run, to pull her hat down, to cover her face, to vanish. The night air, which had been festive, was suddenly thin and cold. Colt stopped. He did not go rigid. He went absolutely still. Nora felt the change in him. It was the stillness of a mountain lion before it springs. She saw his right hand drop, his thumb brushing the polished wooden grip of his revolver. She saw his head turn, his eyes flat and cold as blue ice, scanning the group of men to find the one who had spoken. "Colt," she whispered, her hand darting out, grabbing his forearm. "No!" He didn't look at her. His focus was locked. "He can't say that." "Don't!" she pleaded, her voice desperate. "It's what they want. It's what Brand wants. He's watching. He wants you to start a fight. He wants you to be the savage. Don't! He looked at her then. He saw her terror, the way she was trembling, but he also saw the steel in her eyes. She was right. He was a man of action, and she was telling him that the only winning action was no action at all. His rage was a physical thing, choking him. He had to do something. He looked at the men, who were now shuffling, nervous under his gaze. He looked at Brand, who was smiling, waiting. He looked at the banjo players, and then he looked at Nora. He took a long, slow breath, letting the cold air clear the red from his vision. He deliberately took his hand away from his gun, and he offered it to her, palm up. "Nora," he said, his voice quiet, but it cut through the plaza like a bell. "Dance with me." The plaza went silent. The banjo player's fingers fumbled, the reel dissolving into a clumsy plink-plonk. The man who had laughed choked on his whiskey. Even Silas Brand's smile faltered. This was more shocking than a gunshot. Colt Avery, the silent rancher, the man who wrestled rocks and mended fences, dancing. Nora stared at his hand. It was scarred, calloused, the knuckles split from digging the new channel. It was the hand that had held hers in the mud. It was the most honest thing in the entire territory. I can't," she stammered, her voice a small, broken thing. "Colt, I don't know how. They're all watching." "Good," he said. "Let 'em watch." He kept his hand out. "I don't know how either, but I reckon we're good at learning hard things." She looked at his hand, then at the watching crowd, then at her own 2 feet. She took one of her small, counted breaths. 1, 2, 3. She put her hand in his. He didn't lead her to the shadows at the edge of the plaza. He led her straight into the center, onto the rough wooden dance floor, directly under the brightest string of lanterns. He put his other hand on the small of her back. It was not a familiar embrace. It was a gesture of solidarity, a claiming. It said, "She is with me." Nora, her hand trembling, rested her own on his shoulder. The wool of his shirt was coarse beneath her palm. Colt nodded at the stunned musicians. "Something slow," he commanded. The fiddler, his eyes wide, quickly started a new tune, a soft, hesitant waltz. They began to move. It was not a dance. It was a clumsy, structured walk. Their boots scraped on the rough planks. Colt counted under his breath. A low rumble she could feel more than hear. 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3. Nora kept her eyes fixed on his throat, on the small pulse beating there. She was convinced she would faint from the shame of it, from the focus of 100 eyes. But she didn't faint. She began to feel the rhythm of his counting. She felt the solid, unyielding wall of his chest. She heard his breath, steady and warm, just above her head. She smelled him not sweat, but pine soap, clean cotton, and the faint, sharp scent of cedar from the barn. She risked a glance over his shoulder. The entire town was frozen, watching. The men who had laughed were now staring at their boots, deeply fascinated by the dirt. Maud Ellery stood by the cider barrel, her face a mask of pinched, furious disapproval. Colt had not thrown a punch. He had not fired a shot, but he had won. In 3 simple words, "Dance with me," he had taken their mockery and turned it back on them. He had declared, in front of the whole world, that this woman, this one, was his. She relaxed, just a fraction. Her steps began to match his. 1, 2, 3. She was no longer being held. She was holding on. She looked up at his face. He wasn't looking at the crowd. He was looking at her. His eyes were not cold, not angry. They were just true. And Nora Vale, the woman with the smile askew, felt the corners of her own mouth lift. It was not a grin. It was a small, fragile, unsteady thing. But it was a real smile. They didn't stay for the pie. When the song ended, they turned, as one, and walked away from the light. They left the music, the laughter, and the whispers behind them. The buckboard was tied near the old line shack. A small, one-room cabin on the hill above town that stockmen used during roundups. It was too late, and the night too dark, to make the long ride back to Sparrow Gulch. The night was cool, the air sharp and clean after the party smoke. The moon was a high, bright sickle, and the raucous sound of the banjo faded, replaced by the rush of the wind through the tall grasses. Colt used a key to open the shack's door. He stepped inside, struck a match, and lit the lantern on the small table. It wasn't the harsh, judgmental light of the plaza. This light was a deep, warm honey gold, and it filled the tiny space. The shack was sparse, but Nora had stocked it weeks ago. A clean wool blanket was folded on the narrow cot. A bag of coffee sat next to a small, cold stove. Colt stood by the door, his hat in his hands. The public challenge was over, and the old awkwardness returned. "It's warmer in here anyway," he said, not looking at her. I'll check on the mare. Make sure she's settled." He turned to leave. "Colt!" He stopped, his hand on the door latch. She was standing by the table, her back to him. She was wearing the simple cloth gloves she always wore in town. Slowly, methodically, she began to pull off the left one, finger by finger. She laid it on the table. Then, she pulled off the right. She turned to face him. He was still by the door, a silhouette against the moonlit grass. She walked toward him, stopping just out of his reach. She held her bare hands up, rubbing them together as if to warm them. Then, in a gesture so quiet it was almost an accident, she let the back of her hand, the knuckles scarred from the well rope, brush against the back of his wrist. It was the lightest of touches, skin on skin, a question. Colt stopped breathing. He looked down at her hand, pale in the lantern light, then up at her face. He did not grab her. He did not pull her close. He just looked at her, his eyes asking the question his voice could not. "Are you sure?" "Nora." She held his gaze. Her heart was a frantic bird in her chest. He watched her. He saw her take one shallow breath, then another. He saw her counting 1, 2, 3. And then, slowly, she nodded. Only then did he move. He lifted his hand, the one she had touched, and brought it up. But he didn't touch her face. He didn't touch her hair. He laid his palm flat on her shoulder blade. A solid, respectful, grounding touch. The pressure was gentle, asking one last time, "Are you safe?" She didn't speak. She just leaned into his hand, a fraction of an inch, giving him her weight. That was all the answer he needed. He lowered his head, his movements unhurried, giving her every second, every instant, to turn away. She did not. She tilted her chin up. His lips met hers. It was not a kiss of fire and desperation. It was like the first rain after a 4-month drought. It was quiet. It was warm. And it was slow. It was a kiss of profound, bone-deep relief. It was the end of a 1,000-mile journey. It was the word honest made real. His lips were chapped from the wind, but they were gentle. He tasted of the sharp cider he'd drunk, and of the cold night air. Her hand, the one that had brushed his, rose and clutched the rough wool of his shirt. His other hand moved from her shoulder, up the long line of her neck, his thumb coming to rest in the hollow beneath her ear, holding her steady, as if she were a precious, breakable thing. He did not touch her mark. He did not touch her scar. He just kissed her, the woman. He pulled back first, but only an inch. He rested his forehead against hers. His eyes were closed. She could feel his eyelashes, damp, brush against her skin. They just stood there, breathing the same air, their hearts a loud, matched rhythm in the tiny, golden room. "Nora," he whispered, his voice rough. "You smell like cedar," she whispered back. It was a strange, small, nonsensical thing to say, but it was the first truth that came to her. A short, soft sound came from his chest, a laugh. His breath was warm on her face. "And you," he said, his voice thick. "I like how you count before you do something brave. 1, 2, 3. She hadn't known he'd noticed. He moved away from her, and the loss of his warmth was immediate and sharp. He went to the narrow cot and spread the thick wool blanket. This was the line. He sat on the edge, his back to her, and pulled off his boots. Then he looked at her. He didn't pull her. He didn't command. He just waited. She walked over and sat beside him, not touching, but close enough to feel the heat radiating from his body. They sat shoulder to shoulder, staring at the lantern flame. Nora reached down and pulled a corner of the blanket over her lap. She looked at her hands, now clasped together so tightly her knuckles were white. "I'm still not pretty," she whispered. It wasn't a question. It wasn't a plea for reassurance. It was her oldest, truest, most painful fact. And she had to say it, here, in this moment. Colt was silent for a long moment. He looked at the side of her face, the one turned toward the light. He saw the crimson mark, the silver scar. He saw the line of her jaw and the strength in her neck. He saw the woman who had dived into the flood and the woman who had faced the laughter. He reached out, not to her face, but to her twisting, Clas Monday. He gently covered them with his own. His hand was large and warm, and it stilled their motion. "That's fine," he said, his voice as soft as the lantern light, as deep as the earth. "You are the truth." She let out a breath she felt she'd been holding since she left Lowell. Slowly, she leaned her head until it rested on his shoulder. He did not stiffen. He did not move. He simply accepted the weight. He leaned his own head to rest against hers. They didn't blow out the lantern. They sat in the small, warm shack, the cold night on one side of the walls and the quiet fire of each other on the inside. This intimacy was not a flurry of motion. It was a profound stillness. It was a romance woven from consent, built on tenderness, and sealed with respect. Later, as the lantern flame guttered and the town's music finally died, they slept, their breathing falling, at last, into the same slow rhythm. The night in the line shack had been a truce, a quiet harbor. The dawn was a declaration of war. The sound woke them, or rather, the lack of it. Colt was on his feet before his eyes were fully open, his stockinged feet hitting the cold plank floor. "The water," he said. Nora was right behind him, pulling her dress on over her head, not bothering with buttons. They ran from the shack, not to the stable, but to the small rise that overlooked their valley. Juniper Run was gone. It wasn't just low, it was gone. Where there had been a steady, life-giving stream, the stream that fed their cistern and their pastures, there was now only a wide, glistening ribbon of wet mud, the sound of running water. A sound so constant they had stopped hearing it, was now a deafening silence. "Brand," Colt whispered. The word was not an accusation. It was a sentence. He ran to the mare, vaulted onto her bare back, and was gone. A streak of raw fury disappearing over the ridge. Nora ran back to the buckboard. She had to get back to the ranch. She was the first to see the damage. 2 hours later, the main earth dam at the head of the run, the one Colt's father had built 30 years before, had been cut, not with shovels. The banks were scorched black, dynamite. Brand's men had blown a gap 20 feet wide. The entirety of Juniper Run was now pouring west, into a dead arroyo, a useless canyon that would carry the water 100 miles away to the salt flats. It was an act of profound, arrogant waste. The grass in the east pasture, their primary grazing land, already looked brittle, as if the life had been shocked out of it. The ranch was bleeding out. When Colt returned, he was no longer the man who had held her in the line shack. This was a different creature. His face was a mask of cold, controlled rage. He walked past her, into the cabin, and took his rifle from the wall mount. He began methodically checking the action, sliding shells into the magazine. Nora stepped in front of him. No. Get out of the way, Nora. His voice was flat, devoid of all warmth. No, you're walking into his trap. You'll ride into town. You'll find him. And he'll have a dozen witnesses when you draw on him. His men will put you down. And it will be legal. And the ranch will still be dry. I don't care about legal. He spat. I do, she said, her voice rising. I do. You think this is a fight about fences. This is a fight about that map in Santa Fe. He wants you dead so he can have the land. Don't give it to him. He stopped, his hand on the rifle's lever. She was right. He was thinking like a man, not a rancher. Fighting him won't fill the cistern, she said, her voice softening, pulling him back. Work will. She turned and went to the kitchen table. She unrolled the map, the one that showed the silted-up Navajo channel, the one she had found. He cut the main run. He didn't touch this. He doesn't even know it's here. It's too slow. Nora, that's a trickle. It'll take us a month to dig it out by hand, and by then the herd will be dead. We won't dig, she said. Her finger tapped the map. We'll build a new dam, a smaller one, right here. She pointed to a narrow spot in the old channel, just below where the last of the Juniper Run seepage was still flowing. A wall of earth, Colt scoffed. His men will just tear it down. Not a wall, she said. Her eyes were bright, her mind working, pulling on a past she had tried to forget. Not just a wall. At the Lowell Mill, we used water. We controlled it. A straight wall breaks, but a curve holds. We'll build a secondary dam, shaped like a bow, with the curve against the current. It'll push the force to the sides, not the center. We'll build a silt trap behind it, and a high water overflow, so the next flood doesn't destroy our work. Colt stared at the map. He was seeing it. A piece of engineering, a trap for water. That's smart. That's mill work. Yes, she said, it is. It'll take a dozen men. I don't have a dozen men. Then get what you have, she said, already tying on her work apron. Go now. Get Ronan Shaw. Get the widow, Eliza Dorn. Her plot is downstream from ours. If we go dry, she's next. Get that boy, Milo Ford, the one who's faster than a jackrabbit. I'll start gathering the feed sacks. We'll need every one. Colt looked at her, at the fire in her eyes, the smear of soot still on her cheek from the line shack stove. He leaned the rifle back against the wall. I'll be back by dark. Don't go outside. Just hurry, she said. That night, the new channel was a pit of shadows and secrets. There was no moon. 4 shielded lanterns cast small, trembling pools of yellow light. The air was cold, and the sound of their work was a frantic, muffled percussion. Colt was there, his shoulders straining as he swung a pickaxe. Ronan Shaw, the massive blacksmith, was beside him, his hammer swinging not against an anvil, but against the hard-packed earth, shattering it. Eliza Dorn, a thin, wiry woman with a face like tanned leather, and her 2 teenage sons shoveled the broken earth into the empty feed sacks. And Nora was in the water. It was only knee-deep, but it was freezing, a slurry of mud and icy seepage. She was directing the placement of the bags, her skirt tied up around her thighs, her bare feet sinking into the muck. No, Ronan, she called out, her voice sharp. The base is too narrow. Set them 2 wide, then 1. We need the weight. Set the angle here. The bow faces the water. Ronan, a man who took orders from no one, simply grunted and moved the 100-pound sack where she pointed. He had seen her at the flood. This woman knew water. Young Milo Ford, a boy of about 14, was their eyes. He sat on the high ridge, a dark shape against the stars. They worked for hours. The dam grew, a low, muddy curve of burlap and grit. It was ugly, desperate work. Colt! The high, panicked whisper came from the ridge. Milo Ford was sliding down the scree. Riders, 6 of them, coming from the east. Brand's men, they'd seen the lanterns. Instantly. Ronan dropped his shovel and cocked his heavy rifle. "This time, we finish it," he growled. "No." Colt's voice was sharp. He stepped in front of the blacksmith, blocking his shot. This was his plan, the one he and Nora had made. "That's what he wants. You fire that gun. You're a bushwhacker. He'll have the law on his side." "Then what, Avery? We just let him tear it down." "We let him know they're seen," Colt said. He pulled a small, brass whistle from his shirt pocket. He put it to his lips and blew 3 sharp, piercing blasts. A beat of silence. Then, from the ridge to the north, a single lantern lit up. Another beat. From the west, another lantern. Then another, and another. All along the ridges surrounding the valley, pinpricks of light appeared, one by one, like a new constellation being born. Eliza Dorn's neighbors. The other small ranchers from the high meadows. Colt had spent all afternoon riding, and Milo Ford had run the rest. The whole valley was watching. The half-dozen riders, Brand's men, pulled up short at the edge of the work site. They saw Colt, Ronan, and the half-built dam. And then they saw the circle of silent, watching lights all around them. They were in a trap. Their leader, a big man Nora recognized from the saloon, sneered. "Just watching lights, boys. They're sodbusters, not shooters. Tear it down." He spurred his horse, planning to ride straight through the new dam. "Colt, no!" Nora screamed. But Colt and Ronan were already moving, not to fight, but to defend the dam. The other men charged behind their leader. Nora saw it happening. She saw the men fanning out. They were going to trample the work, spook the horses, and be gone in a minute. She grabbed one of the shielded lanterns. "Milo!" she yelled. "This way, they're getting away!" She didn't run at them. She ran away from them, along the bank of the new channel, holding the lantern high. The men, seeing a lone woman and a boy, thought they were fleeing. 3 of them peeled off, laughing, spurring their horses to chase her. "Grab the woman!" one of them yelled. "Nora!" Colt bellowed, his voice raw with panic. "It's the trap," she screamed back. "The silt!" She led the 3 riders at a dead run along the dark, flat bank. This was the part of the channel they hadn't dug out yet, the part she had warned Colt about, the old Navajo silt bed, wet and unstable from the new seepage. "Now, Milo!" she shrieked. She threw her lantern sideways, into the scrub, and threw herself flat onto the hard-packed ground. Milo did the same. The horses, running at a full gallop, hit the mud flat. It wasn't quicksand, it was worse. It was a thick, sucking, glutinous mire. The led horse screamed, a terrible, high-pitched sound, as its front hooves punched through the crust and sank to the cannon bone. The horse flipped, sending its rider flying. The other 2 horses bogged down instantly, churning and fighting, sinking to their bellies, their riders cursing and trying to jump free. They were trapped. No one was hurt badly, but they were caught, helpless, in the cold, dark mud. By the time the leader of the group realized what had happened, Ronan Shaw was on him. The blacksmith didn't use his gun. He grabbed the man by the coat and dragged him bodily from the saddle. The man hit the ground hard. Ronan put a boot on his chest. "I oughta—" "The book," Colt said, his voice hard. "Check his pockets." Ronan's hand plunged into the man's coat. He pulled out a small, oilskin-wrapped ledger. He flipped it open in the lantern light. "Well, well," Ronan growled. "Looky here. Payment, CL, $5, new fence shears. Payment, TR, $20, dynamite, 1 case." Colt took the book. On the last page was a summary of expenses, and at the bottom, an authorization. It wasn't a signature. It was a clear, unmistakable thumbprint, pressed hard into a smear of blue ink. The next morning, Nora, wearing her clean gray dress and her hat, walked into the office of Deputy Harlan Quaid. Colt and Ronan waited on the boardwalk outside. Quaid looked up from his newspaper, his feet on his desk. "Mrs. Avery, what can I do for—" Nora placed the mud-stained, oilskin ledger on his desk. "You can arrest Silas Brand." Quaid slowly took his feet off the desk. He opened the book. He read the entries. His face, which had been comfortable, grew pale. "Mrs. Avery," he began, clearing his throat. This is just a book. There's no name." "Turn to the last page. Deputy," Nora said. "The blue thumbprint. I'm told it's a perfect match for the one Mr. Brand left on the contribution ledger for your new jailhouse fund." Quaid paled. He closed the book, pushing it away as if it were a snake. "Now, hold on. Mr. Brand is a benefactor. He supports this town. Progress. The railroad, he pays a significant portion of the town's operating budget. So he bought the jail before he needed to use it," Nora said. "That's convenient." "This is a messy, civil matter," Quaid stammered, standing up. "It's your word against his. I can't just, He's right, Deputy." All three of them turned. Maud Ellery stood in the open doorway. She had been at her Gazette office, across the street, and had seen Nora walk in. "It is a messy business," Maud said, stepping inside. Her eyes were sharp. She had followed the whispers of last night's showdown and had been bitterly disappointed there was no gunfight to report. Instead, she'd heard a story of whistles, lanterns, and a mud trap. She looked at Nora. She saw the woman she had caricatured, the smile askew. But this woman wasn't hiding. She was standing in the lawman's office, her face bare, wielding a piece of evidence. She hadn't stooped to Brand's level. She hadn't met violence with violence. She had met it with strategy. And then she had brought the dirty evidence to the law. Maud felt a strange, unwelcome prickle of respect. "Maud, this isn't—" Quaid started. "Last night, Deputy," Maud said, cutting him off. "Brand's men attempted to destroy private property. They were repelled, captured, and this evidence was secured. Mrs. Avery is now filing a formal complaint. You will accept it. You will open an investigation, and you will subpoena Mr. Brand. Or," she leaned in, "or the Gazette's entire front page tomorrow will be this ledger. Every page, every name, every dollar, alongside a very detailed accounting of your jailhouse fund. I wonder how progress will look then." Quaid stared at her, then at Nora, then at the ledger. He snatched the book. I'll look into it." Maud's article ran the next morning. It wasn't the one she had threatened. It was better. It told the whole story. The cut dam, the night build, the whistle, the mud trap, the ledger. The headline was simple, and it changed everything. A woman holds the water for the whole valley. But Silas Brand was not a man to be beaten by ink. He read the article, smiled, and sent for his lawyer from Santa Fe. 2 days later, Deputy Quaid, his face a picture of misery, rode out to Sparrow Gulch. He wasn't serving an arrest warrant for Brand. He was serving a summons for Colt. "He's not suing you for the damn Colt," Quaid said, refusing to meet his eyes. "He's charging you." "Charging me with what?" Colt said. "Criminal trespass and damage to property of the Rio Palma Railroad." Nora stepped forward. "What property?" Quaid pointed to the line of red stakes. "Those stakes, the new channel you dug, the one that's saving your ranch. It cut right through Brand's official survey line. He's claiming you, and I quote, willfully and maliciously destroyed $50 worth of railroad survey markers." It was a brilliant, vicious trap. "A circuit judge is riding in," Quaid said, climbing back on his horse. "He'll hold a field court at the Henley Livery, on the new moon." He looked at Colt, his face full of pity. "That's 1 week. Colt, you've got 1 week to find a way out of this one." The summons lay on the table between them. It was the only thing in the cabin that seemed real. The trial was in 6 days. The circuit judge was already on his way, and Silas Brand was in town, buying drinks at the Dusty Bell, accepting congratulations. Colt and Nora worked in a grim, silent partnership. They mapped out their defense. It was thin, they had the ledger, yes, but Brand's lawyer, a slick man from Santa Fe, had already dismissed it as a rancher's fabrication. The only hard fact was the one Brand had created, Colt Avery, had destroyed railroad property. The red stakes. They were talking in low, hopeless tones about land deeds when the rider came. He was not from Mesa Lark. He was a relay rider. His horse lathered. He carried a single and folded telegram. It was for N. Vale, care of Avery Ranch. Nora's hands, the ones that had been so steady in the flood, trembled as she took it. She unfolded the paper. The words were stark. Coyote Reach. Mother gravely ill. Lung fever. Come at once. The air left the cabin. Colt watched her face, which had gone as white as bleached flour. Coyote Reach, he asked, his voice rough. A mining camp, she whispered, her eyes staring at the paper. 2 territories over. My mother, she works in a cook tent. She has no one else. Colt's mind was moving, fast and brutal. Nora, the stage it runs once a week. It leaves tomorrow morning. No, she said, looking up, her eyes wide with a new, sharper panic. The telegram. It's 4 days old. The stage leaves in 1 hour. 1 hour. Colt did the math. A 3-day ride, if she was lucky. 3 days there, another 3 days back. The trial was in 5 days. If she left, she would miss it. He would face Brand, the judge, and the town, utterly alone. Nora looked at him, her face a mask of agony. She was torn in two, the woman she had left and the man she had found. Colt looked at the summons, then at her. He saw the fire in Lowell. He saw the girl in the burning mill. He saw the man who had told her she didn't suit his future. He would not be that man. Go, he said. Colt, the trial. Brand, I can't. Go, Nora. His voice was hard, not with anger, but with a terrible resolve. He would not hold her. He would not use fear or guilt to keep her. He had asked for the true one, and the true one had to be free to choose. Go to your mother. She ran to her room, her body moving with a desperate, fractured energy. She threw her few things into the small carpet bag, her sewing box, the cedar box. She left the unsent letters. She was at the door, her hat already on, pulled low. She stopped at the table. She looked at the summons. She pulled a piece of paper from her pocket, the stub of a pencil. She wrote, her hand flying, I will come back. I will, if you still want the true one. She left it on the table, a small white flag next to the ugly legal document. She ran for the door. He caught her on the porch, as she was about to jump to the ground. He didn't grab her. He just stood in her way. You'll need this, he said. He pressed something small and cold into her hand. It was a pearl-handled folding knife, no bigger than his thumb. It was my mother's. It's small, but it's sharp. For protection. Before she could speak, he pressed a second item into her other hand, a small, worn leather pouch tied with a string. And this, he said, his voice softer. She fumbled with the string. Inside, resting on her palm, was a small cascade of dried, brown seeds. Asters, he said, the ones from the creek bed, the ones I had that first day. I saved them. He closed her fingers over them. For planting. When you come home. He didn't say if, he said when. Nora's throat was too thick to speak. She just nodded, her eyes burning. He lifted her onto the buckboard. He slapped the mare's rump. Go! Don't miss that stage! She flew down the track, not looking back, the dust rising up behind her like a collapsing wall. Colt stood on the porch. He watched until the dust was just a memory. The cabin, which had become a home, was just a box again. A cold, Empty box. He looked at the summons. He looked at her note. He went inside, picked up his rifle, and walked out toward the new dam. If he was going to lose this land, he was going to lose it working. Coyote Reach was not a town. It was a scar, a gash in a red canyon where 200 men, desperate for tin, had clawed a living from the earth. It was a place of tents, lean-tos, and raw plank shacks. The air smelled of sulfur, unwashed bodies, and despair. Nora found her mother in the hospital tent, which was just 6 cots lined up on a dirt floor. Her mother was a small, gray wisp of a woman, her breath a shallow, wet rattle in her chest. For 3 days, Nora did not sleep. She sat, she boiled water, she spooned broth into her mother's mouth, she wiped her face with cool rags. She fought the lung fever with the only weapon she had: patience and a refusal to leave. But she had no money. The camp doctor, a tired man who smelled of whiskey, said her mother needed quinine, and quinine cost coin. Nora looked at her hands. She was a worker. She went to the camp's one store, a wagon propped on blocks. She spent the last of her emergency money, not on the medicine, but on 50 pounds of flour, salt, and yeast. At 3 a.m, while her mother slept, Nora built a fire in a derelict clay oven she'd found behind the cook tent. She began to bake. By sunrise, the smell of fresh, hot bread cut through the sulphurous air. The miners, emerging from the shaft, their faces black with soot, stopped. It was the smell of home, of a life they had all forgotten. She sold every loaf in 10 minutes. She did it again the next day, and the next. She paid for the quinine. She paid for fresh milk, and in the afternoons, she sat by her mother's cot, her hat on her lap. A young miner, a boy from Missouri with shy eyes, approached her. He held a crumpled letter. "Ma'am," he whispered, his face red under the grime. I can't. My ma, could you?" Nora looked at the boy, who couldn't be more than 16. She took the letter, and in the dim, stuffy tent, she began to read. Her voice was low and clear. She read about his dog, about the corn crop, about his little sister. When she finished, the boy was weeping silently. "Thank her," he whispered. "Tell her I'm good. Tell her I'm eaten." Nora took out her own small bit of paper, and she wrote his lies for him. Soon, others came. The camp was full of men who could swing a pick, but not sign their own names. Nora became their voice. She sat on a crate by the mine entrance, her face open to the harsh light, her pen moving. She read to them of births and wrote for them of hardship. She, who had hidden her face from the world, was now the one person they trusted to see their truest, most vulnerable selves. At night, by a single candle, she wrote in her own journal. She was not writing to Elspeth anymore. "He will be at the trial today. He will be alone. I am afraid. I am not afraid for the land or the water. I am afraid for him. He is a man who speaks in actions. I keep remembering his hands, how they fumbled with my apron strings. Clumsy and patient. I remember the sound of his laugh in the line shack. It was short, and it sounded rusty, as if it hadn't been used in a very long time. I am sitting here, writing letters for strangers. While the one man who saw me is facing a judge alone, I pray he is not as clumsy with his words as he was with that apron bow." Back in Mesa Lark, Colt was a ghost. He had dug, he had mended. He had reinforced the new dam until it was a fortress of mud and burlap. The trial was tomorrow. He had hired a lawyer, old Judge Biddle, a man who had been disbarred in Santa Fe and now drank his days away. Biddle had looked at the summons, looked at Colt, and shrugged. "You crossed his line. Son, he staked it. You dug through it. You damaged his property. Doesn't matter if it was a dead survey. It was his." "It's my land," Colt had insisted. "Not according to the federal grant. He'll win, Colt. He'll get his $50 judgment. And the moment you can't pay it, He'll put a lien on your ranch. He'll own you in a month. Colt was lost. He returned to the empty cabin. The silence was suffocating. He saw Nora's apron, still hanging on a hook by the door. He saw her mending basket, and in it, he saw the gray dress, the one she had worn in the flood. It was still stiff with dried mud, and the hem was torn where she had scrambled on the rocks. He picked it up. It was small. It smelled faintly of her, of soap and river water. He sat by the fire, just as he had seen her do. He took her cedar sewing box. He opened it. He found a needle and thread. His hands, so sure with an axe handle, were a disaster. It took him 5 minutes to thread the needle. His face inches from the eye. His tongue stuck out in concentration. He cursed, softly. But he did it. And then he began to sew. His stitches were a catastrophe. They were huge, black, crooked lines, like a child's drawing of a railroad track. He sewed the torn hem. He sewed the rip in the side. He was clumsy. He was patient. He sewed his grief and his fear and his stubborn hope into that ruined gray dress. It was the only prayer he knew how to make. When he was done, he held it up. It was ugly. It was mended. He went to the barn. He found a plank of clean pinon wood. He took the pearl-handled knife he had almost given Nora, a larger one, and he began to carve. He was not a carver. The letters were deep, gouged from the wood. It took him half the night. The next morning, the day of the trial, he took the mended dress. He hung it on a hook on the front porch, where the wind coming up the gulch would stir the skirt, as if she were standing right there. Above the cabin door, he nailed the plank of wood. For the truest heart I've known. He did not do it for the town. He did not do it for the press. He did it for the wind and for the truth, so that when they came up the pass, they would know where to stop. He put on his one clean shirt, the one he had worn to meet her, and rode to town to be condemned. The town saw the sign. Ronan Shaw was the first. He rode out at noon, ostensibly to check on the dam. He saw the mended dress, fluttering like a lonely flag. He read the carved sign. He stood there for a full minute, his big hands on his hips. He turned, rode back to his smithy, and returned. He didn't say a word. He just hung a perfectly wrought iron hook, twisted into the shape of a flowering aster, on the porch beam, a proper place to hang a lantern. Eliza Dorn came by. She left a small, knitted shawl, the color of a pale blue sky, folded on the porch swing. Mrs. Davies left a jar of her prize-winning apple preserves. The town, one by one, was leaving its allegiance on the porch. They were leaving gifts for a woman who wasn't there, under a sign for a man who was about to lose everything. Maud Ellery came last. She walked up the path, her face pinched. She saw the dress. She read the sign. She saw the small, growing pile of talismans. She felt a hot, unfamiliar flush of shame. She pulled a folded newspaper from her satchel. It was her own article, the one headlined, "A Woman Holds the Water." She placed it on the porch step, weighed it down with a smooth river stone, and walked away. In Coyote Reach, Nora's mother woke up. Her fever was gone. She was weak, her voice a reedy whisper, but her eyes were clear. "Nora," she breathed. "You came." "I came," Nora said, her hand over her mother's. A supply wagon had arrived, and with it, mail. A single and dirty envelope was pushed into Nora's hand. It was addressed to Mrs. Avery, Coyote Reach. She tore it open. The handwriting was a child's, labored and round. "Dear Mrs. Avery, I hope your ma is well. I am fine. The dam is holding. Ronan Shaw says it's smarter than a beaver. The water is still running. Thanks to you, Mr. Avery he's quiet. The trial is today. I think he is sad. Please come home. Your friend, Milo Ford." Today, she looked at her mother, who had drifted back to sleep. She was safe. Today, Nora stood up. She was too late. The trial would be over, but he was alone. She walked to the small, cracked mirror that hung on the tent pole. She looked at her reflection. Her face was gaunt from lack of sleep, smudged with soot from the bread oven. Her scar, her mark. She poured water from the pitcher and washed her face. She pinned her hair, her hands moving with a new, sure purpose. She took her hat. She put it on her head. She looked at herself. She did not pull the brim down. She did not hide her cheek. She just settled it, square. It was a hat. It was no longer a shield. She kissed her mother's forehead. "I have to go home," she whispered. She ran to the freight master, begging a ride on a wagon hauling tin ore. It was slow. It was hot. The dust was a choking, physical thing. She knew she was too late for the trial. She could only pray she was not too late for Colt. The wagon crested the final rise into Sparrow Gulch. The sun was hot, the air thick with the smell of dust and juniper. Her heart was a wild, frantic drum against her ribs, a horse breaking for the barn. She looked. The cabin was there. It was still. But there was something on the porch, a speck of gray, twisting in the wind. She didn't wait for the wagon to stop. She jumped, hitting the ground running. She ran up the path, her lungs on fire. She stopped. She saw the dress, her dress, the hem sewn with black, crooked, loving stitches. She saw the carved sign, "For the truest heart I've known." She saw the shawl, the preserves, the iron hook, and the folded newspaper. She was too late for the trial. But she was home. The Henley livery was not a hall of justice. It was a barn. It smelled of hay dust, axle grease, and the sharp ammonia tang of nervous animals. But on this day, it was the only court Mesa Lark had. The circuit judge, a thin, dyspeptic man named Elias Thorne, sat at a rough plank table set up where the forge ought to be. His face was gray with trail dust, and his black robes looked absurd and funereal in the dusty shafts of light. Beside him sat a man who did not belong a U.S. Marshal, quiet, with cold eyes, his badge a small, dull star on his vest. He was here to ensure the judge, a federal official, was not interfered with, but his gaze swept the packed room with a bored, professional disinterest. The entire town was crammed shoulder to shoulder on benches, on hay bales, and standing in the rafters. They were not here for a trial about $50 worth of wooden stakes. They were here for the final act of a war. Silas Brand sat at the front, next to his lawyer. The lawyer, a man named Hargrove, had come all the way from Santa Fe. He wore a crisp suit, and his satchel was full of embossed, important-looking books. He looked at the livery stable with the distaste of a man who has just found a roach in his soup. At the other table sat Colt Avery. He was alone. His lawyer, old Judge Biddle, had arrived drunk, stumbled over a hay bale, and was now snoring softly in the tack room. Colt sat upright, his one clean shirt buttoned to the neck, his hat in his lap. He looked like a man about to be hanged. "This court is in session," Judge Thorne said, his voice like dry gravel. "We are here to hear the complaint of the Rio Palma Railroad versus Mr. Coulter Avery. Mr. Hargrove, you may proceed." Hargrove stood, all smooth confidence. "Thank you, Your Honor. This is a simple, almost trivial matter, which we would not have bothered this esteemed court with were it not for the principle of the thing." He smiled at the crowd, a predator's smile. "The Rio Palma Railroad, in an act of great vision, is bringing progress to this territory. We surveyed a line, as is our right under federal grant. We marked that line with survey stakes, official property of the railroad. The defendant, Mr. Avery, in an act of petty, malicious vandalism, did willfully destroy this property." He gestured to Colt. "A simple matter of trespass and destruction, $50 in damages." He then unrolled his own map, a new, beautiful one, all bright colors and sharp lines. "But there is a second, more serious charge. Your Honor, this man," he pointed at Colt, In digging his ditch did illegally and intentionally divert water from a federally protected waterway, Juniper Run, for his own use. That, Your Honor, is water theft." The crowd murmured, "Water theft." That was a hanging word. "We ask for the $50 in damages," Hargrove said smoothly, "and for a permanent injunction, ordering Mr. Avery to cease his diversion, fill in his illegal channel, and restore the water to its proper, railroad-managed course." It was a death sentence. It would kill the ranch in a week. Judge Thorne looked at Colt. "Mr. Avery, your counsel." He gestured to the tack room, where a loud snore just sounded. Colt stood up. His hands were clasped so tightly his knuckles were white. "Your Honor, I didn't—" He was a man of action, not words. He was drowning. He looked at Ronan Shaw, at Eliza Dorn. Their faces were grim. They could not help him. "Mr. Avery," the judge said, his patience already gone. "Do you deny you dug the channel? Do you deny you crossed his line?" "I dug it," Colt said, his voice raw. "But it was my water. He blew my dam. Hearsay," Hargrove snapped. "Unsupported accusations. The fact is, he admits to the act. I move for summary judgment." "Wait." The voice was not loud, but it was so clear, so sudden, that every person in the livery turned. The large stable door was open to the afternoon sun, and in that bright, dusty rectangle, she stood. Nora Vale. She was caked in dust from the freight wagon. Her dress was rumpled, her face pale with exhaustion. But she was not the woman who had arrived in Mesa Lark. Her hat was on, but it was pushed back, sitting on her shoulders, held by its string. Her face, her entire face, the crimson birthmark. The silver scar was open, exposed, and illuminated by the shaft of sunlight. The crowd, the ones who had whispered, the ones who had giggled, the ones who had drawn cartoons, went dead silent. This was not the smile askew. This was not the wide-brimmed bride. This was the woman who had swum the flood. She walked down the center aisle, her boots making no sound in the soft dirt. She did not look at the crowd. She looked at Colt. He was staring at her, his face a mask of disbelief, of hope so painful it looked like agony. She gave him a small, fierce nod. Then she turned to the judge. "Your Honor," she said. Hargrove shot to his feet. "Your Honor, who is this woman? She has no standing here. This is a—" "I am Nora Vale Avery," she said, her voice shaking but gaining strength. "I am his wife, and I am a witness." She was at the front now. She did not look at Brand. She did not look at his lawyer. She looked at the judge. From her carpet bag, she pulled not one, but 3 items. "Mr. Hargrove accuses my husband of malicious vandalism. I am here to show you what malice truly is." She laid the first item on the table. It was the mud-stained oilskin ledger. "This," she said, "is the defendant's ledger. It details payments for fence shears, for dynamite. It is signed with the thumbprint of Silas Brand." Brand shot a murderous look at his lawyer. Hargrove waved a dismissive hand. "A forgery, Your Honor, a child's fantasy. It's unsigned. It proves nothing." "It proves intent," Nora said, her voice sharp. "But it is not my only proof." She laid down the second item, a tattered book. "This is my household journal, and in it, my rain log. I have recorded the rainfall every day since my arrival, including the day of the flood at Boxwood Wash, and the 2 days before it, when the sky was yellow and the air was still." The judge leaned forward, frowning. "And the point of this, Mrs. Avery?" "The point, sir, is that Mr. Brand's men blew our dam on a Tuesday. This log shows it had not rained in a week. There was no natural pressure on that dam. It was a deliberate, malicious act of destruction, in a dry season, designed to kill our land." "Objection!" Hargrove shouted. "This is amateur speculation. This woman is not an engineer." No, Nora said. She unrolled her third item. It was her own hand-drawn map, her diagram of the new dam, the curved bow, the silt trap, the overflow channel. I am not an engineer. I am a mill worker, and I do know water. This, she said, her finger tracing the drawing, is the dam my husband and I built. This is not water theft. Your Honor, this is water rescue. This is an act of preservation. This is the diagram of a community fighting to save itself from a man who would waste an entire river just to win a bet. The livery was so quiet, the only sound was the snoring from the tack room. And as for the charge of trespass, Nora said, her voice ringing. Mr. Hargrove is correct. We dug our channel across his line. We destroyed his red stakes. We did it to survive. But this, she tapped the ledger, is the proof of why? We were not acting with malice. We were acting in self-defense. She turned, for the first time, and looked at Silas Brand. The true crime is not the destruction of $50 worth of stakes. The true crime is the destruction of a man's livelihood, of a town's water supply, for corporate greed. That is the case that should be on this docket. She is magnificent, a voice said. Everyone turned. Maud Ellery was standing up from her bench, her hands clasped. Your Honor, Maud said, stepping into the aisle. I am Maud Ellery, editor of the Mesa Lark Gazette, and I must confess. Hargrove looked apoplectic. This is not a church, Your Honor. It is a court. This is an absurd circus. Sit down, Mr. Hargrove. The judge snapped. He was looking at Nora's diagram. He was looking at Maud. He was a frontier judge. He was here for the truth, not just the law. Proceed, Mrs. Ellery. I have not been kind to Mrs. Avery, Maud said, her voice trembling, but loud. I have, in my own paper, been cruel. I ridiculed her. I did not understand her. I was wrong. She looked at Nora, a look of profound, public apology. And I'm here to testify that what she says is the truth. I was at the flood. I saw her. I saw what she did. And I saw this town, my neighbors, rally to her plan to save their own water. This ledger, she pointed to the book, was brought to Deputy Quaid. He was reluctant to act because Mr. Brand is a powerful man, a man who funds our jail. Deputy Quaid, standing at the back, looked as if he wanted the earth to swallow him. Mrs. Avery is right, Maud declared. This is not a trial about stakes. This is a trial about the soul of this town, and I, for one, stand with the Averys. She sat down. A wave of murmurs, of amens, and that's right, swept the room. Silas Brand saw it. He saw the judge's face, now cold and hard. He saw the jury, the entire town, all looking at him. He saw the U.S. Marshal, no longer bored, watching him with a new, sharp interest. He had lost, while Hargrove was sputtering. Your Honor, this is an outrage. A kangaroo court. Brand slowly, quietly, stood up from his chair. He began to edge, step by step, backward toward the livery's side door, the one that led to the corrals. He was almost there. No, you don't. Ronan Shaw, all 300 pounds of him, stepped in front of the door. Beside him was Eliza Dorn, and her 2 tall sons, and 3 other ranchers. The door was blocked by a wall of denim and resolve. Brand froze. His hand, in a desperate, foolish move, darted inside his suit coat. I wouldn't. The U.S. Marshal said, his voice calm. He had not moved from his chair, but his hand was now resting on his own gun. Brand's hand came out, empty. He was trapped. And then a sound, high and clear. Wee weet. It was Milo Ford, standing on a hay bale. He had Colt's brass whistle. He blew it again, the signal that had once called the neighbors to the ridge. It was a call to justice. The marshal stood up. He walked, Not to Colt, but to Silas Brand. "Mr. Brand," he said, his voice conversational. "This summons for Mr. Avery seems ill-conceived. I'm formally dismissing it on behalf of the federal court." "You can't do that," Hargrove shrieked. "I can," the marshal said. "But I'm more interested in this." He picked up the ledger from the judge's table, and in the testimony of Mrs. Ellery and Mrs. Avery, he turned to Brand. "Silas Brand, you are under arrest. Not for this nonsense. You are under arrest for conspiracy to destroy private property, for the illegal use of explosives, and for attempting to bribe a federal deputy." He pulled a pair of handcuffs from his belt. The click as they fastened around Brand's wrists was the loudest sound Nora had ever heard. The room exploded. People were cheering, stamping their feet. Ronan Shaw was laughing, a sound like a rock slide. Colt did not move. He did not cheer. He sat at the table. His body slumped, as if the strings holding him up had been cut. The fight was over. He had won. He had won. He looked up through the cheering chaos, and his eyes found hers. He didn't smile. His face was too full of exhaustion, of a gratitude so deep it was painful. He just looked at her. A long, silent question, a question that had nothing to do with land, or water, or Silas Brand. Are we all right?" Nora's face, which had been a mask of stone and fire, finally broke. Her eyes filled with tears, blurring the sight of him. She had come home. She had been too late for the trial, but she had been just in time for the truth. She nodded, the tears spilling, tracking clean paths through the dust on her cheeks. "We are true," she answered, her heart speaking to his, and that is enough. That night, for the first time in a month, Mesa Lark breathed. The air was clear, the wind was quiet, the fight was over, and the water, Nora's water, was still running in the channel. A soft, steady promise in the dark. It was not a Sunday, and the building was not a church. There was no stained glass, no polished altar, no high-strung preacher promising damnation. The wedding was held on a Tuesday, in the late afternoon, when the light in the high country turns from harsh white to a deep, forgiving gold. The place was Blue Quail Meadow, a wide expanse of grassland high on the ridge, where the wind always blew, and you could see for 100 miles. The entire town was there, but they were not a crowd. They were a circle. They stood back, 50 yards from the center, a ring of quiet, respectful witnesses. Ronan Shaw was there, his massive arms scrubbed clean, his hat in his hands. Eliza Dorn stood with her 2 tall sons, their faces solemn, Mrs. Davies was there, holding the hand of the child Nora had saved, and the child held a small, crumpled bunch of flowers. Even Maud Ellery was there. She stood at the edge of the circle, not with her husband, but alone, by her small, portable printing press, as if she were a reporter covering the signing of a peace treaty. In the center of this wide, human circle, under the enormous, empty blue sky, stood Colt Avery. He wore his one clean shirt, the one that smelled of pine soap and sun. He was not a man built for standing still. He kept shifting his weight, his hands clasped behind his back, then in front, then shoved into his pockets. Then he saw her, and he went perfectly still. Nora was walking toward him. She was alone. There was no father to give her away. She was giving herself. She was not wearing white. She was wearing the gray dress. It was the dress she had arrived in, the dress she had worn in the flood, the dress he had found, mud-caked and torn, in her mending basket. He had mended it, and she was wearing his mending. The hem, which had been ripped on the rocks, was now held together by a row of his stitches. They were, as she had seen when she found it on the porch, a disaster. They were huge, black, crooked stitches, the work of a hand more used to a rope than a needle. They were clumsy, they were impatient, and they were the most beautiful, most honest seams she had ever seen. She wore the dress like a banner. It was a tapestry of her past, his care, and their shared, violent, muddy, triumphant truth. Her hat was off, her hair was pinned up, her face, with its story of fire and birth, was open to the sky. And she did not flinch from the light. She stopped in front of him. There was no preacher. Old Thatcher Hale, who had ranched in these hills for 60 years, stepped forward. He was a man who looked like he'd been carved from the same red rock as the canyons. He held a small, dented harmonica in one hand and a Bible so tattered its cover was gone. He looked at Colt. He looked at Nora. He nodded, as if confirming something he already knew. "Well," he said, his voice a dry rustle, "the book says a lot about grand things, floods and fires and angels. But I've been out here a long time. Love, out here. It ain't always the thunder. It ain't the grand gestures." He looked at the circle of neighbors, and then back at the two of them. "Mostly, it's just two people, standing still, next to each other. When the wind's blowing hard and the water's low, it's about holding the line. I reckon you two know more about that than I can preach." He cleared his throat. "So, you'll just say your piece. God's listening." He stepped back. Colt turned to Nora. He looked at her mended dress, at the crooked black line his own hands had made. He looked at her face. He had never, he realized, seen anything so beautiful in his entire life. Nora held out her hand. It was trembling, not from fear, but from the simple, overwhelming weight of the moment. Colt didn't just take her hand. He enveloped it. His large, calloused, scarred hand covered hers, and the trembling stopped. He did not let go. Nora took a breath. She looked at their joined hands. "Colt," she began, her voice a whisper, but it carried on the wind. I came here with very little. I thought I had nothing to give." She looked up at him, her eyes clear. I have working hands." She flexed her fingers in his. "I have a face that has its own story, and I have a heart that was cold, and that was afraid, and that is learning to stay. It is all I have." Colt swallowed. The lump in his throat was hard as a stone. He had rehearsed nothing. He had no words. He only had the truth. "Nora," he said, his voice thick, rough. That is everything. That is everything I ever asked for, and I will keep it safe." That was all. That was the vow. Thatcher Hale nodded. "Then that's—" "Wait," Nora said. She looked up at Colt. The wind was pulling strands of her hair free, whipping them across her cheek. She had to say it, one last time. She had to offer him the final, sharpest, truest piece of herself. "Colt," she whispered, "I am still not pretty." Colt looked at her. He saw the woman who had faced down a giggle, a room full of whispers, a saloon brawler, and a corrupt lawyer. He saw the woman who had dived into a flood, who had taught a boy to breathe, and who had trusted him with her secrets. A smile, the one she had seen at the well, the one she had seen in the line shack, finally bloomed, full and certain. It lit his entire face. He didn't answer her with words. Not at first. He just leaned in, slowly, and rested his forehead against hers. They stood there for a long moment, their eyes closed, breathing the same air. "Nora," he whispered, his lips almost touching hers. "That's fine." He pulled back just enough to look her in the eyes. "I don't need fancy. I need honest." And then he kissed her. It was not the hesitant, questioning kiss of the line shack. It was a claim. It was the sealing of a deed. He kissed her in the open meadow, in the gold light, in front of the entire town. It was a long, warm, deep kiss that tasted of sunlight and the sharp, clean wind. It was the end of 1,000 miles. It was the taste of a promise kept. His hand, the one that wasn't holding hers, moved to her back. He laid his palm flat against the mended seam of her dress. His fingers spread over the crooked, honest stitches he had made. He held her, not with passion, but with a profound, unshakable patience. He was holding the line. Nora's free hand, which had been clenched at her side, rose. She didn't touch his face. She wrapped her arm around his neck, pulling herself closer, and leaned her head against his chest. She pressed herself against him, her heart to his heart, and for the first time in her life, she felt completely, utterly, and perfectly safe. A thin, reedy sound filled the air. Old Man Thatcher was playing his harmonica. It wasn't a wedding march. It was a slow, simple air, a tune for watching cattle or staring at the stars. And then, a small movement. Milo Ford, his face scrubbed, stepped out from the circle. He held a pouch. He walked forward, followed by the Davies twins and the other children. They reached the couple, who were just pulling apart, their faces dazed. Milo grinned, and with a whoop, he reached into the pouch and tossed a handful of something at their feet. Seeds. No, not seeds. Flowers. Small, purple, wild asters. Nora gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked at the ground. The children were scattering handfuls of the flowers, the same flowers he had held, wilted and uprooted. On the day she arrived, the seeds he had saved, the seeds she had planted, in a hopeful, desperate line, along the bank of their new dam. They had bloomed. Milo was laughing. Colt was laughing. That short, rusty bark of a sound. And Nora, her hand in his, looked at the scattering of purple flowers on the dry grass. And she laughed, too. At the edge of the meadow, Maud Ellery watched. She saw the mended dress. She saw the flowers. She saw the kiss. She turned back to her press. She took the old, ugly type from her tray, the letters that spelled out "Smile Askew." She threw them into her scrap box. She took out new type. Her hands, for once, were not angry. They were swift. She set the new headline. In Mesa Lark, the truth brings the water home. The imaginary camera, the one that had watched Nora step off the stage in the harsh, judging light, began to pull back. It rose, leaving the circle of neighbors. It left the sound of the harmonica. It drifted over the golden meadow, showing two small, strong figures, standing hand in hand, surrounded by a scatter of purple flowers. They were small. The land was enormous. The wind that had been so mean, so full of grit, was just a breath now. It was a warm wind, moving through the high grass. It lifted the hem of the mended gray dress. It sounded, finally, like the world breathing out. Love did not need to be pretty to be vast. It just needed to be true to last. Thank you so much for listening to our story. We would love to know where in the world you're listening from. Please, leave a comment below to share your thoughts and say hello. And if you enjoyed this story, please consider subscribing to our channel, Wild West Stories 1850. Give this video a like and support us further by hitting that hype button so this story can be heard by even more folks.